powerful man in the history of the human species, spent 12 years wishing he could not see. Paul Atreides, Muad'Dib, Emperor of the known universe, the Kwisatz Haderach, whose prescient consciousness could perceive the probability space in its totality, governed the Imperium from the throne he had taken at Arrakis. And every day of the governance was a day spent inside the prison that the prescient vision had become. The vision showed him everything. The vision showed him the jihad's killing. The vision showed him the 61 billion dead. The vision showed him the futures the probability space contained, and the assessment sustained across 12 years of governance. That every path through the space that included his survival led to consequences the assessment identified as the least terrible available option. The least terrible. Not the good, not the desirable, not the option the person choosing would have chosen if the choosing had been free. The least terrible, the option whose consequences, however devastating, were less devastating than the consequences of every alternative the probability space contained. This was Paul's condition. The most powerful consciousness in human history, trapped in a probability space whose structure the consciousness could perceive but could not alter. The vision that was supposed to be power was the power's prison. The awareness that was supposed to be freedom was the freedom's elimination. The prescience that was supposed to enable was the thing that constrained, that showed the consequences of every choice so completely that the choosing was no longer the exercise of will, but the calculation of the least damage. Dune Messiah is the story of what the prison did to the prisoner, the story of Paul's destruction, not by his enemies, though the enemies were present, not by the conspiracy, though the conspiracy was operating, not by the political landscape's resistance to his governance, though the resistance was sustained, by the prescience itself, by the awareness that the Messiah's role had imposed on the consciousness that filled it, by the knowledge that destroyed the knower. The 12 years between Paul's ascension and the events of Dune Messiah were the years in which the jihad's consequences unfolded across the known universe, and the consequences' scale was the scale that the prescient vision had shown Paul before the choice to accept the messianic role was made. 61 billion people died. The number is stated with the precision the Imperium's records provided, and the precision was itself a form of horror. The administrative accounting of the destruction the messianic mobilization had produced. The census of the killed conducted with the institutional efficiency that mass killing and institutional record keeping shared. The killing was not Paul's. This is the fact that the narrative must state directly, because the popular understanding of the jihad sometimes attributes the killing to Paul's direction, and the attribution is wrong. Paul did not command the jihad's campaigns. Paul did not plan the jihad's battles. Paul did not direct the Fremen armies to the worlds the jihad consumed. The jihad was the Fremen's, was the expression of the religious fervour that the Lisan al-Gaib's identification had generated, conducted by the Fremen warriors, whose faith drove them across the known universe with the evangelical violence that weaponized faith produced. The killing was also Paul's. This is the fact the narrative must state alongside the first, because the attribution's wrongness does not eliminate the responsibility's reality. Paul had accepted the messianic role. The acceptance had activated the cultural machinery the Missionaria Protectiva had installed. The machinery, once activated, produced the mobilization the machinery was designed to produce. The mobilization produced the jihad. The jihad produced the killing. The chain of causation ran from Paul's acceptance through the machinery's activation, through the mobilization, through the jihad, through the killing. Paul was at the chain's beginning. The killing was at the chain's end. The chain connected them. The responsibility's quality was the responsibility of causation rather than the responsibility of direction. Paul caused the jihad by accepting the role. Paul did not direct the jihad by commanding the campaigns. The distinction mattered for the moral assessment, the assessment of whether the killing was Paul's fault, whether the deaths were Paul's burden, whether the 61 billion were Paul's moral accounts content. Paul's assessment was that the distinction did not matter. The prescient vision, the awareness that showed Paul the consequences of every choice, showed Paul the killing before the killing occurred. Paul saw the jihad before the jihad happened. Paul chose the path that included the jihad because the path was the least terrible option the probability space contained. Paul accepted the 61 billion deaths as the cost of the path the assessment identified as least terrible. The acceptance was not endorsement. The acceptance was the acceptance of the least terrible option's cost. The acknowledgement that the cost was real and that the cost was worth the cost's payment given the alternatives the probability space showed were available. Paul did not want the killing. Paul permitted the killing because the not permitting produced consequences the permitting avoided. The 12 years were the years in which Paul lived with the permitting, lived with the awareness that the killing was happening, that the killing was the consequence of the choice the awareness had informed, that the killing's continuation was the ongoing expression of the causation the choice had initiated. The living was endurance rather than governance, was the sustained experience of the consequences the prescient vision had shown and the choice had accepted. The governance was competent. This fact sometimes surprises the people who encounter the Dune Messiah narrative expecting the tragedy of a failed ruler, because Paul's governance of the Imperium was not a failure in the administrative dimension. The Imperium functioned, the political landscape was managed, the economic relationships were maintained. The institutional operations that the interstellar civilization required were conducted with the competence that the governance's resources, the prescient vision, the Fremen military capability, the institutional apparatus, the Corino dynasty had bequeathed, provided. The competence was not the problem. The problem was the prescient vision's relationship with the governance, the relationship that made the competence possible and that made the competence's cost unbearable. The prescient vision showed Paul the consequences of every governmental decision. The vision showed the decision's outcomes, the political effects, the economic implications, the social consequences that the decision would produce across the timescales the vision encompassed. The vision's showing made the decision-making informed. The vision's showing also made the decision-making agonizing, because the vision showed not only the chosen decision's consequences, but the unchosen decision's consequences, and the comparison between the chosen and the unchosen was the comparison that the conscious mind could not perform without the suffering the comparison produced. Every decision Paul made was the decision that the prescient vision identified as least terrible. Every decision Paul did not make was the decision whose consequences the prescient vision showed were more terrible. The governance was conducted through the sustained assessment of terribleness, through the continuous evaluation of which option was least damaging, which path was least destructive, which choice produced the fewest consequences the choosing consciousness found unacceptable. The assessment was exhausting. Not physically, the prescient consciousness did not tire in the way the ordinary consciousness tired. Morally, the sustained assessment of terribleness, the continuous evaluation of which option killed fewer people, which path destroyed less, which choice imposed the minimum suffering, was the moral labour that the prescient governance required, and the labour was conducted without the relief that the ordinary governance's ignorance of consequences provided. The ordinary governor did not see the consequences. The ordinary governor made decisions, assessed the available information, chose the option the assessment identified as best, and lived with whatever consequences the choice produced. The consequences were experienced after the fact, were encountered as the choice's products rather than as the choice's inputs. The ordinary governor was surprised by consequences. The surprise was painful. The surprise was also limited, was the pain of the unexpected rather than the pain of the foreseen. Paul was never surprised. The prescient governor saw the consequences before the choice was made, saw the full range of the consequences, the complete spectrum of the outcomes, the totality of the effects the choice would produce. The seeing made the choice informed. The seeing also made the choice a calculation conducted in full awareness of every consequence the calculation would generate. The informed choice was the burdened choice, the choice whose information included the complete knowledge of the suffering the choice would cause. The burden was cumulative. Each decision added its consequences to the consciousness's load. Each choice added its sufferings to the awareness's content. The governance's 12 years accumulated the load and the content with the sustained addition that 12 years of informed decision-making produced. The accumulation was the governance's cost, the price the prescient consciousness paid for the governance's competence. The Kizarate was the institutional expression of the governance's religious dimension, and the Kizarate's calcification was one of the 12 years' most consequential developments. The Kizarate, the religious institution that managed the Imperium's spiritual life in the name of the Muad'Dib, was the bureaucracy of belief. The institution administered the faith the messianic identification had produced, managed the temples, the ceremonies, the doctrinal interpretations that the Muad'Dib's worship required. The institution was large. The institution was wealthy. The institution was politically significant, was one of the Imperium's most influential institutional actors, whose management of the spiritual dimension provided the institutional leverage the religious authority generated. The Kizarate calcified. The living faith, the Fremen's desert belief in the Lisan al-Gaib, the passionate conviction that the messianic identification had generated, was transformed by the institutional management into the administered doctrine the bureaucracy produced. The transformation was institutional rather than theological, was the consequence of the faith's management by the bureaucratic apparatus rather than the consequence of the faith's content's change. The faith's content was preserved. The faith's expression was managed. The management's effect was the calcification, the conversion of the living belief into the administered observance. Paul observed the calcification with the awareness the prescient vision provided. He could see the institution's trajectory, could see the Kizarate's development toward the institutional rigidity that the management's bureaucratic character would produce. He could see the trajectory and could not prevent it, because the prevention would have required the interference with the institutional dynamics the trajectory was produced by, and the interference's consequences, visible in the prescient assessment, were worse than the calcification's consequences. The inability to prevent was the prescient vision's recurring experience. Paul could see the developments. Paul could not change the developments. The seeing and the not changing were simultaneous, were the two dimensions of the prescient experience that the vision's comprehensive awareness produced. The awareness showed the development. The awareness also showed that the development's prevention would produce consequences that exceeded the development's costs. The awareness showed, and the awareness constrained simultaneously. The constrained awareness was the prison. The prison was not the absence of information, was not the darkness of ignorance that prevented the prisoner from seeing the walls. The prison was the presence of complete information, was the light of comprehensive awareness that showed the prisoner every wall, every bar, every dimension of the confinement, and showed simultaneously that every attempt to escape the confinement would produce consequences worse than the confinement itself. Paul lived in this prison for 12 years. Every day of the governance was a day inside the comprehensive awareness. Every decision was a decision made with the full knowledge of every consequence. Every consequence was a consequence foreseen and accepted as the least terrible available. The governance was the prison's operation, was the sustained exercise of the constrained awareness's least terrible option selection. The personal dimension of Paul's 12-year governance was the dimension that the political narrative sometimes overlooked, but that the tragedy's full development required for its expression. Paul was a person. The statement seems obvious, but is necessary because the messianic role's demands tended to obscure the personhood the role was imposed on. Paul was not simply the Kwisatz Haderach, was not simply the prescient consciousness that perceived the probability space. Paul was a person, a human being whose consciousness included the personal dimensions that the prescient capability's cosmic scope did not eliminate, the emotional attachments, the personal relationships, the needs and the desires and the feelings that the human consciousness produced regardless of the consciousness's enhanced capabilities. Chani was the personal dimension's center. The Fremen woman whose companionship had sustained Paul through the desert years, through the transformation from Caladan heir to desert Messiah, through the prescient development's emergence, through the battle for Arrakis and the governance's assumption, was the person whose presence in Paul's life was the personal relationship the prescient consciousness had not eliminated and could not replace. Chani was not Paul's wife. The political marriage, the union with Irulan, that provided the dynastic continuity the political settlement required, was the marriage that the governance's political dimension had produced. Chani was Paul's partner, was the person whose relationship with Paul was personal rather than political, emotional rather than strategic, chosen rather than arranged. The distinction between the political wife and the personal partner was the distinction that the governance's personal dimension was organized around. Paul's political relationship with Irulan was the relationship the political settlement required, the formal union that provided the Carino connection the settlement's legitimacy demanded. Paul's personal relationship with Chani was the relationship the person required, the intimate connection that the human consciousness needed for the emotional maintenance the governance's psychological demands imposed. Irulan was present. Irulan was visible. Irulan occupied the position the political settlement had assigned her, the emperor's wife, the Carino princess whose marriage to the Atreides emperor provided the dynasty's legitimacy's bridge. Irulan was not the companion. Irulan was the instrument, the political mechanism whose function was the legitimacy's provision rather than the person's companionship. The instrumentalization was painful for Irulan. The texts document this with the attention Irulan's experience deserved, the sustained discomfort of a person whose training and whose capabilities equipped her for political participation at the highest level, who was positioned at the highest level, who was not permitted to participate at the level her capabilities and her position warranted, because the person whose court she inhabited did not value her participation. The pain was Irulan's experience of the governance's personal dimension. The governance produced personal consequences, produced the marginalization, the instrumentalization, the emotional cost, that the political arrangement's personal dimensions imposed on the persons the arrangement encompassed. The jihad's moral weight was the weight Paul carried through the 12 years, and the weight's character deserves examination, because the weight was the thing that was destroying Paul even before the conspiracy began its operation. 61 billion dead. The number was present in Paul's awareness, was not the statistic that the ordinary consciousness could process and manage and eventually accommodate through the mechanisms of emotional distance and temporal removal. The number was vivid, was present in the prescient consciousness as the full, detailed, individually rendered awareness of what the number meant. Paul did not know the number abstractly. Paul knew the number prescient lie, knew the consequences the number represented, knew the suffering the deaths constituted, knew the individual's experiences that the number's aggregate concealed. The knowledge was the weight. The prescient consciousness did not perceive the 61 billion as a number. The prescient consciousness perceived the 61 billion as the 61 billion, as the individuals whose deaths the jihad produced, whose suffering the killing imposed, whose experiences of the killing's violence the prescient awareness could perceive with a clarity the awareness brought to every dimension of the probability space's content. The weight was unbearable, not in the metaphorical sense that emotional burdens are described as unbearable when the burdens are severe, in the functional sense that the consciousness could not sustain the weight's full presence without the consciousness's integrity being threatened. The weight was too large for the consciousness to carry. The weight was there. The consciousness carried it anyway. The carrying was the damage. Paul was damaged by the jihad's weight. The 12 years of governance were 12 years of damage, 12 years in which the consciousness that carried the 61 billion deaths' full awareness was progressively impaired by the carrying's sustained demands. The impairment was not cognitive. The prescient capability was not reduced. The analytical processing was not degraded. The governance's competence was not diminished. The impairment was personal, was the erosion of the personal dimensions of the consciousness that the weight's sustained presence produced. The erosion was the tragedy's progressive expression. Paul was being destroyed, not by the enemies whose conspiracy would eventually contribute to the destruction's mechanics, but by the awareness the prescient capability imposed. The destruction was internal, was occurring inside the consciousness rather than in the political landscape around it. The destruction was sustained, was progressing across the 12 years with the cumulative force the sustained weight's presence generated. The destruction's external expression was Paul's relationship with the governance. The relationship changed across the 12 years, shifted from the engagement that the initial governance's demands had produced to the endurance that the sustained governance's weight imposed. Paul governed. Paul did not want to govern. Paul governed because the prescient vision showed him that the not governing produced worse consequences than the governing. The governing was the least terrible option. The governing was also the thing that was destroying the governor. The destruction's most personal expression was Paul's relationship with Chani. The relationship was Paul's lifeline, was the personal connection that sustained the person inside the prescient consciousness, that provided the emotional maintenance the governance's psychological demands required. The relationship was also the thing that prescient vision showed Paul he would lose. The vision showed Paul the probability space's structure, and the structure included Cheney's death. The vision showed Paul that every path through the space that included his survival and the governance's continuation led to Cheney's death through the mechanisms the probability space's dynamics generated. Paul knew Chaney would die. Paul knew the death was coming. Paul knew the death's mechanisms, knew that Irulan's interference was part of the mechanism, knew that the interference's consequences would produce the crisis that the death would occur in. Paul knew and could not prevent, because the prevention's consequences, visible in the prescient assessment, were worse than the death's consequences. The knowing was the cruelest dimension of the prescient prison. The consciousness that could see everything, could see the beloved's death approaching. The consciousness could not prevent the approach. The consciousness could only watch, could only observe the mechanism's operation, the interference's progression, the crisis's development, with the comprehensive awareness that the watching's helplessness made agonizing. Paul watched Chani's death approach for years. The watching was the governance's deepest cost, the price the prescient consciousness paid for the awareness the consciousness possessed. The conspiracy was the Imperium's institutional response to the governance the revolution had imposed. And the conspiracy's design revealed the institutional intelligence that the governance's opponents possessed. The conspiracy was not improvised. The conspiracy was designed, was the product of sustained institutional assessment of the governance's vulnerabilities, of careful analysis of the prescient consciousness's limitations, of strategic planning that identified the mechanisms through which the governance's defences could be circumvented. The conspiracy's designers were not amateurs. The conspiracy's designers were the Imperium's most capable institutional actors, and the conspiracy's design reflected the quality of the intelligence the designers brought to the design. The Bene Tleilax were the conspiracy's first institutional participant. The secretive society of genetic manipulators, the faction whose capabilities included the production of golas and the deployment of face dancers, participated because the governance's continuation threatened the Tleilax institutional autonomy. Paul's governance, comprehensive in its scope, informed by the prescient vision's awareness, managed with the competence the prescient capability provided, reduced the space within which the Tleilax could operate independently. The governance's comprehensiveness constrained the Tleilax's institutional freedom, and the constraint was the motivation the participation required. The Tleilax contribution to the conspiracy was technological rather than political. The Tleilax provided the Gola, the biological resurrection of Duncan Idaho, the Atreides swordmaster, whose death defending the household during the Harkonnen assault had been the original timeline's most honoured sacrifice. The Gola was grown from the cells the Tleilax had obtained from Duncan's body. Was produced through the axolotl tank technology the Tleilax maintained, was developed with the capabilities the original Duncan had possessed, and with the potential for the original personality's recovery. The Gola was the conspiracy's emotional weapon. The weapon's design was directed at Paul's personal vulnerability rather than at the governance's political structure, at the person inside the prescient consciousness rather than at the consciousness's political operation. The Gola was Duncan. The Gola was Paul's dead friend, resurrected in a body that looked like Duncan, that moved like Duncan, that carried the physical capabilities Duncan had possessed. The Gola was the emotional lever, the instrument designed to exploit Paul's attachment to the dead man through the emotional response the dead man's resurrection would produce. The Gola was given the name Hate. The name was the Tleilax's designation, was the label the conspiracy's designers assigned to the instrument the Gola was designed to be. The name was not Duncan. The name was the denial of the Duncaness, was the assertion that the Gola was the conspiracy's instrument rather than the Atreides retainer, that the body's origin was irrelevant to the body's purpose, that the person Duncan had been was not the person the Gola Hate was. The denial was incomplete. The Gola carried Duncan's genetics. The Gola carried Duncan's physical capabilities. The Gola carried, in the biological memory that Tleilax's technology preserved, the potential for the original personality's recovery. The potential was not active, was not the conscious presence of Duncan's identity in the Gola's awareness. The potential was dormant, was the biological substrate from which the personality could be recovered under the right conditions. The conspiracy's plan for the Gola was this: present the Gola to Paul, allow Paul's emotional response to the dead friend's resurrection to develop the attachment the emotional lever required, use the attachment to produce the vulnerability the conspiracy needed. The vulnerability was the prescient consciousness's weakness, the weakness that the emotional dimension produced in the awareness the prescient capability provided. The plan was sophisticated because the plan's designers understood the prescient consciousness character. The consciousness could perceive the probability space. The consciousness could assess the political landscape. The consciousness could evaluate the strategic situation. The consciousness could not, or the designers believed it could not, fully manage the emotional response the personal attachment produced. The emotions were the gap, the dimension of the consciousness that the prescience did not fully control, the vulnerability that the comprehensive awareness did not fully protect. The Spacing Guild was the conspiracy's second institutional participant, and the Guild's contribution was the contribution that made the conspiracy viable against a prescient target. The Guild's contribution was Edric, the navigator, the spice-transformed being whose prescient perception guided the ships through fold space, was the conspiracy's tactical asset. Not for the navigation, for the prescient blind spot. Edric's prescient capability created an interference pattern in the probability space. The navigator's own prescient perception, the awareness of the probable futures that the navigator's spice-transformed consciousness produced, interacted with Paul's prescient perception in ways that disrupted Paul's awareness of the events the navigator's perception encompassed. The interaction produced the blind spot, the region of the probability space that Paul could not perceive clearly, because Edric's prescient field was interfering with the clarity the perception normally provided. The blind spot was not absolute. Paul could perceive the conspiracy's existence, could see, in the probability space, the indication that a conspiracy was operating, that institutional actors were coordinating against the governance, that the political landscape included a threat the landscape's conventional dynamics did not account for. Paul could perceive the conspiracy's existence without perceiving the conspiracy's content. The blind spot concealed the content, the participants, the mechanisms, the operational details that the conspiracy's execution would require, behind the interference the navigator's prescient field produced. The partial concealment was sufficient. The conspiracy did not need to be invisible, did not need to operate in the complete darkness that total concealment would have provided. The conspiracy needed to be blurred, needed to operate behind the interference that prevented the prescient consciousness from seeing the operational details the conspiracy's prevention would have required. The blur was sufficient. The blur was what Edric provided. The Guild's motivation for participation was the spice. Paul controlled Arrakis. Paul controlled the spice production. Paul's governance determined the spice's availability, the spice's distribution, the spice's pricing. The Guild's navigational capability depended on the spice the navigators consumed. The Guild's institutional survival depended on the spice supply's reliability. Paul's control of the supply gave Paul leverage over the Guild that the Guild's institutional interests could not accommodate indefinitely. The conspiracy offered the Guild the prospect of the leverage's reduction, the prospect of a post-Paul political landscape in which the spice supplies management was conducted through the institutional mechanisms the Guild could influence, rather than through the personal authority the prescient consciousness exercised. The prospect was the motivation. The prospect was sufficient. Irulan was the conspiracy's third participant, and Irulan's participation was the participation that most directly affected the conspiracy's personal dimension. Irulan was Paul's wife. The political marriage, the union that provided the Corrino dynasty's legitimacy's transfer to the Atreides governance, positioned Irulan inside the governance's most intimate sphere. Irulan was present in the court. Irulan had access to the governance's domestic dimension. Irulan was positioned to act within the governance's personal space in ways the external conspirators could not. Irulan's motivation was personal rather than institutional. The Bene Gesserit training Irulan had received gave her the capabilities the institutional participation required. The analytical assessment, the strategic thinking, the operational discretion the conspiracy's activities demanded. The motivation that drove the participation was the marginalization the governance's personal dynamics imposed, the sustained experience of being the Emperor's wife without being the Emperor's partner, of occupying the position's privileges without receiving the position's intimacy, of being present in the governance's domestic sphere without being valued in the governance's personal dimension. The marginalization was Paul's choice. Paul had chosen Chani. The choice was personal, was the expression of the emotional attachment the desert years had produced, the connection that the prescient consciousness's comprehensive awareness had not eliminated and could not replace. The choice was also the marginalization's cause, was the reason Irulan occupied the position without the partnership, was the explanation for the instrumentalization the position's personal emptiness constituted. Irulan administered contraceptive drugs. The administration was Irulan's independent action, was conducted on her own initiative, motivated by the convergence of personal interest and institutional alignment that the marginalization produced. The drugs prevented Chani from conceiving, maintained the condition in which no air from Chani's body displaced the political relevance Irulan's position as Paul's wife provided. The administration was sustained across years. The drugs were administered covertly, were introduced into Chani's diet through the mechanisms Irulan's domestic access provided, were maintained at the levels the contraceptive function required, were sustained across the years of the governance's personal dynamics operation. Paul knew. The prescient vision showed Paul the administration's operation, showed the mechanisms, the timing, the consequences the administration was producing. Paul knew Irulan was administering the drugs. Paul knew the drugs were preventing Chani from conceiving. Paul knew the prevention's continuation was the ongoing expression of the marginalization's dynamics. Paul did not prevent the administration, the prescient vision's assessment of the prevention's consequences. The consequences of intervening in the administration, of confronting Irulan, of exposing the activity to the governance's political mechanisms, identified the prevention's consequences as worse than the administration's continuation. The administration was part of the probability space's structure. The administration's continuation was part of the path through the space the assessment identified as least terrible. The knowing and the not preventing were the prescient prison's most personal expression in the governance's domestic dimension. Paul knew his partner was being drugged. Paul knew the drugging was preventing the children the partnership might have produced. Paul knew and did not act, because the acting's consequences, visible in the comprehensive awareness, exceeded the not acting's consequences. The not acting was the prescient consciousness's sustained acceptance of the domestic dimension's operation. The acceptance was not endorsement, was not the approval of the administration's morality or the agreement with the administration's purposes. The acceptance was the least terrible options selection, the calculation that the domestic dimension's current operation, however painful, was less damaging than the operation's disruption. The conspiracy's design, the combination of the Tlilax Gola, the Guild Navigator's prescient blind spot, and Irulan's domestic access, was the design that the institutional intelligence assessment had concluded was necessary for the governance's circumvention. The design's logic was this: the prescient consciousness could see everything. The consciousness could not see through the navigator's prescient interference. The consciousness could not manage the emotional vulnerability the Gola's presence would exploit. The consciousness could not address the domestic activities the wife's access enabled without the addressing's consequences exceeding the activity's costs. The logic identified 3 dimensions of the prescient consciousness's vulnerability, 3 areas in which the comprehensive awareness was less than comprehensive, in which the consciousness's defenses were less than complete, in which the governance's protection was less than total. The conspiracy operated in all 3 dimensions simultaneously, deployed the navigator's interference. The Gola's emotional weapon and the wife's domestic access in the coordinated operation the conspiracy's design specified. The coordination was the conspiracy's most sophisticated feature. The 3 dimensions simultaneous operation produced a combined effect that exceeded what any single dimension's operation could have produced. The navigator's interference concealed the conspiracy's operational details. The Gola's emotional weapon exploited the consciousness's personal vulnerability. The wife's domestic activities maintained the conditions the conspiracy's personal dimension required. The combination's effect was the governance's progressive destabilization, the sustained erosion of the consciousness's capacity to manage the governance's demands while simultaneously managing the conspiracy's multidimensional operation. The destabilization was gradual. The conspiracy did not produce an immediate crisis, did not generate the dramatic confrontation that a less sophisticated design might have attempted. The conspiracy produced a progressive weakening, a sustained, multi-dimensional erosion of the governance's personal and institutional stability that accumulated its effects across the months and years of the conspiracy's operation. The gradualness was deliberate. The conspiracy's designers understood that the prescient consciousness could manage a crisis, could perceive the crisis's dynamics, could assess the crisis's options, could select the least terrible response with the competence the prescient capability provided. The consciousness was less capable of managing the gradual erosion, was less equipped to address the sustained, multi-dimensional weakening that did not produce the dramatic moment the crisis management capability was designed for. The erosion operated below the crisis threshold. The Gola's emotional effect accumulated below the level that would have triggered the governance's crisis response. The wife's domestic activities continued below the level that the governance's intervention would have addressed. The navigator's interference maintained the concealment below the level that the prescient consciousness could penetrate. The combination's sub-threshold operation was the conspiracy's most dangerous feature, the characteristic that allowed the erosion to accumulate without triggering the defenses the accumulation would eventually overwhelm. Hate, the Duncan Idaho Gola, was the conspiracy's most complex instrument, and examining the instrument's operation reveals the conspiracy's most sophisticated dimension. The Gola was presented to Paul as a gift. The Bene Tleilax offered the Gola to the Emperor, offered the resurrected body of the dead friend as the Tleilax's expression of the institutional loyalty the gesture was designed to suggest. The offering was a lie, was the conspiracy's mechanism for the introduction of the emotional weapon into the governance's personal sphere. The lie was effective because the offering's emotional content, the resurrection of the dead friend, the return of the beloved retainer, produced the emotional response the lie was designed to generate. Paul accepted the Gola. The acceptance was informed by the prescient vision. Paul could see the Gola's role in the probability space's structure, could perceive the Gola's involvement in the dynamics the space's assessment encompassed. Paul accepted the Gola despite the perception, accepted the instrument despite knowing the instrument's purpose, accepted the emotional weapon despite understanding the weapon's design. The acceptance's rationality was the prescient assessment's product. The assessment showed Paul that the Gola's acceptance produced consequences that were less terrible than the Gola's rejection. The rejection would have produced political consequences, the Tleilax's response, the political dynamics adjustment, the probability space's restructuring that the assessment identified as worse than the acceptance's consequences. Paul accepted because the acceptance was the least terrible option. The acceptance was also personal. Paul wanted Duncan back. The prescient consciousness that assessed the probability space's structure was also the human consciousness that mourned the dead friend, that carried the grief the friend's death had produced, that experienced the longing the death's permanence had imposed. The Gola's presence, the body that looked like Duncan, the face that carried Duncan's features, the movements that reproduced Duncan's physical patterns, activated the grief and the longing with the intensity the emotional attachment's depth produced. The activation was the weapon's operation. The Gola's presence in Paul's domestic sphere, the dead friend's body moving through the governance's personal space, carrying the physical echo of the person the governance's operator had loved, was the sustained emotional stimulus the conspiracy had designed the Gola to provide. The stimulus accumulated. The stimulus's accumulation weakened the consciousness's emotional resilience, reduced the capacity for the emotional management the governance's demands required, eroded the stability the personal dimension's maintenance depended on. Hate was not Duncan. This was the fact the Gola's presence continuously demonstrated and continuously contradicted. The Gola carried Duncan's body. The Gola did not carry Duncan's personality, did not possess the memories, the loyalties, the personal qualities that had made Duncan the person Paul had loved. The Gola was a different person in Duncan's body, was a consciousness whose formation was the Tleilax's rather than the Atreides, whose loyalties were the conspiracies rather than the households, whose purposes were the instruments rather than the friends. The contradiction, Duncan's body without Duncan's self, was the emotional weapon's cutting edge. The presence that looked like the friend was not the friend. The absence that the death had produced was not remedied by the resurrection, was present in the Gola's existence as the gap between the body's familiarity and the personality's foreignness. The gap was the wound, the emotional injury the Gola's presence continuously reopened by continuously demonstrating that the friend was dead despite the body's survival. Paul experienced the gap with the awareness the prescient consciousness provided. The awareness showed Paul the gap's dynamics, showed the emotional injury's operation, the weapon's mechanism, the conspiracy's design. The awareness also showed Paul the gap's consequences. showed the emotional erosion the injury was producing, the resilience's reduction the erosion was generating, the stability's compromise the reduction was creating. The awareness showed Paul everything about the weapon's operation. The awareness could not prevent the weapon's effect. The emotional response, the grief, the longing, the pain the gap produced was not under the prescient consciousness's control. The emotions operated through the biological mechanisms the consciousness's architecture included. Through the neurological pathways the emotional response traversed, through the biochemical cascades the emotional activation generated. The prescient consciousness could perceive the emotion's operation. The prescient consciousness could not override the operation. The inability to override was the prescient consciousness's emotional vulnerability, the vulnerability the conspiracy had identified and that the Gola was designed to exploit. The consciousness that could see everything could not control everything. The consciousness that could perceive the emotional weapon's operation could not prevent the weapon's effects. The perception and the control were different capabilities, and the consciousness possessed the perception without possessing the control. Chani returned to the Fremen diet. The decision, made by Chani rather than by Paul, conducted through Chani's own assessment of her body's needs rather than through the prescient consciousness's direction, was the decision that overcame Irulan's contraceptive interference and that initiated the crisis the conspiracy's dynamics would intensify. The return to the high-spice Fremen diet was Chani's response to the years of unexplained infertility the contraceptive administration had produced. Chani did not know about the drugs, did not know that Irulan was administering the contraceptives that prevented the conception the partnership wanted. Chani knew that the conception was not occurring. Chani assessed the non-occurrence through the Fremen understanding of the body's relationship with the environment, through the cultural knowledge the Fremen tradition maintained about the spice's effects on the body's reproductive function. Chani concluded that the diet's modification, the return to the high-spice Fremen nutritional patterns the court's cuisine had displaced, might address the infertility the court's dietary conditions had produced. The conclusion was correct in its effect, if not in its mechanism. The return to the high-spice diet overcame the contraceptive drugs' effects, overwhelmed the biochemical interference the drugs imposed with the spice saturation's biochemical force. The conception occurred. The pregnancy began. The crisis the prescient vision had foreseen began its development. Paul saw the pregnancy's consequences. The prescient vision showed Paul the probability space's response to the conception, showed the pregnancy's trajectory, the complications the trajectory would produce, the outcome the complications would generate. The vision showed Paul that Chani would die. The vision showed Paul that the death would occur in the childbirth the pregnancy was progressing toward. The vision showed Paul that the death was the consequence of the years of contraceptive interference, that the drug's sustained administration had produced the biochemical conditions that would make the pregnancy's complications lethal. The vision showed Paul the death's approach. The vision could not show Paul the death's prevention. Every path through the probability space that the prescient assessment encompassed, every alternative the comprehensive awareness could identify, led to Chani's death through the mechanisms the probability space's structure generated. The death was embedded in the space's structure. The death was not a consequence the structure's navigation could avoid. The death was the structure. Paul watched the death approach, watched the pregnancy progress, watched the complications develop, watched the woman he loved carry the pregnancy that the prescient vision showed would kill her, knowing the killing was coming, knowing the killing's mechanisms, knowing the killing's inevitability. The watching was the prescient prison's most devastating expression. The consciousness that could see everything, could see the beloved's death approaching with the clarity the vision brought to every dimension of the probability space's content. The consciousness could not prevent the approach. The consciousness could only watch. The stone burner was the conspiracy's most dramatic intervention, the weapon whose deployment produced the physical consequence that the conspiracy's institutional participants had not planned, but that the conspiracy's dynamics generated. The stone burner was deployed by Korba, a Fremen figure whose involvement in the conspiracy's execution reflected the governance's internal tensions. The weapon was a subatomic device whose destructive mechanism was different from the atomics the Great Convention prohibited. The weapon's deployment in the vicinity of the Arrakeen governance was the most direct physical attack the conspiracy produced, the most dramatic escalation from the conspiracy's sub-threshold operation to the crisis-level confrontation the sub-threshold operation's accumulation had been building toward. The weapon's radiation destroyed Paul's eyes. The blindness was physical, the visual organs were eliminated, the biological capacity for sight was destroyed. The destruction was permanent. The medical technology the Imperium maintained could not restore the destroyed organs. The blindness was irreversible by any medical intervention the governance's resources could provide. Paul navigated the blindness through the prescient vision. The navigation, the use of the prescient perception's awareness of the probable future to replace the physical sight's awareness of the present, was one of the most remarkable demonstrations of the prescient capability the saga documented. Paul could see through the prescience, could perceive the environment's probable configuration with the clarity the prescient awareness provided, could navigate the physical space through the prescient space's perception of the physical space's probable state. The navigation was functional. Paul walked. Paul interacted. Paul governed. The blindness was invisible, was concealed by the prescient navigation's effectiveness, was hidden from the governance's observers by the seamless replacement of the physical sight with the prescient sight. The observers could not tell that Paul was blind. The prescient navigation made the blindness undetectable. The navigation was also a dependency. The prescient sight's replacement of the physical sight created the reliance on the prescient vision's continuity for the basic functions the physical sight had supported. The reliance was total. If the prescient vision faltered, the navigation would fail, the blindness would become the functional blindness the prescient replacement was concealing. The reliance was fragile, was contingent on the prescient capability's sustained operation, on the vision's continued clarity, on the probability space's continued navigability. The fragility was the blindness's most consequential feature. The physical sight was robust, was maintained by the biological organ's ongoing operation, was sustained without the conscious effort the maintenance required. The prescient sight was fragile, was maintained by the consciousness's sustained engagement with the probability space, was contingent on the engagement's continued capability. The blindness was the conspiracy's contribution to the tragedy's mechanics, was the physical consequence that the conspiracy's dynamics generated and that the tragedy's resolution would incorporate. The blindness did not destroy Paul. The blindness made the destruction's mechanics more immediate, made the dependency on the prescient vision more total, made the vision's eventual faltering more consequential, made the loss of the vision more devastating when the loss occurred. The crisis converged. The conspiracy's multiple dimensions, the Goler's emotional operation, the navigator's prescient concealment, the wife's domestic interference, combined with the pregnancy's progression and the blindness's dependency to produce the convergence that the prescient vision had foreseen and that the prescient consciousness could not prevent. The convergence was the probability space's structure reaching the configuration the prescient assessment had long identified as the least terrible path's most terrible phase. The path that Paul had been walking, the 12-year progression through the governance's demands, the jihad's weight, the conspiracy's erosion, was reaching the point the prescient assessment had shown was the path's most devastating section. Chinese labor began. The pregnancy's culmination, the childbirth that the prescient vision had shown would produce the twins and would kill the mother, was the event the convergence was organized around. The labor was difficult. The complications the years of contraceptive interference had produced, the biochemical conditions the drug-sustained administration had created, were manifesting in the childbirth's medical dimension. Paul was present, the blind man whose prescient vision showed him the labor's progression with the clarity the physical sight would have provided, who could see, through the prescient awareness, every dimension of the childbirth's medical development, every complication the labor's progression generated. Every moment of the experience the woman he loved was enduring, was present for the event the prescient vision had told him would kill her. The helplessness was total. The prescient consciousness that could see everything could do nothing. The comprehensive awareness that perceived the medical complications' development could not address the complications' biological mechanisms. The consciousness that could navigate the probability space could not navigate the biological crisis the space's structure contained. Paul could see Chani dying. Paul could not prevent Chani from dying. Chani died. The death occurred in the childbirth. The medical crisis, the years of contraceptive interference had produced culminating in the biological failure the crisis generated. Chani died, giving birth to the twins Leto and Ganima, the children whose preborn consciousness would carry the saga's narrative into its next phase. The twins survived. The death produced the life, the biological exchange that the childbirth's medical dynamics enacted, the mother's death accompanying the children's delivery. The twins were pre-born, their consciousness activated by the genetics the breeding program had produced and the environmental spice saturation the pregnancy's conditions provided. The twins carried the ancestral presences. The twins carried the prescient potential. The twins carried the genetic configuration the breeding program's management had generated across the generations the program encompassed. Paul held the twins, the blind man whose prescient vision showed him the children's faces with the clarity the physical sight would have provided, held the children whose mother's death the prescient vision had shown him, and whose birth the mother's death had accompanied. The holding was the most human moment in the prescient consciousness's 12-year operation, the moment at which the person inside the consciousness was present without the consciousness's mediation, the moment at which the grief and the wonder and the devastation and the hope coexisted in the awareness the moment produced. The hate Gola's transformation occurred in the crisis's context. The recovery of the original Duncan Idaho's personality from the biological substrate the Gola's body contained. The transformation was triggered by the emotional crisis the events produced. The Gola, the instrument the conspiracy had designed for Paul's emotional exploitation, experienced the crisis's events with the proximity the instrument's placement in Paul's domestic sphere provided. The crisis's emotional intensity, the death, the birth, the blindness, the convergence, produced the emotional conditions the personality's recovery required. The recovery was not planned. The conspiracy's design did not include the personality's recovery. The conspiracy's designers had intended the Gola to remain the instrument, had not anticipated that the instrument's biological substrate would generate the recovery the crisis's emotional conditions triggered. The recovery was the conspiracy's unintended product, the consequence the conspiracy's dynamics generated through the mechanisms the conspiracy's designers did not control. Duncan emerged. The original personality, the Atreides swordmaster whose loyalty had been absolute, whose death defending the household had been the ultimate expression of the retainer's devotion, reasserted itself through the biological memory the Gholar's body contained. The emergence was dramatic, was the sudden presence of the original consciousness in the instrument's body. The return of the person the conspiracy had used the body to deny. The emergence was Paul's consolation. The dead friend was returned, was recovered from the biological substrate the Tleilax's technology had preserved, was present in the body the conspiracy had provided as an instrument, and that the recovery had transformed into a person. The recovery was the conspiracy's gift, the unintended consequence of the conspiracy's operation that provided Paul with the return the conspiracy's design was supposed to prevent. The gift was insufficient. Duncan's return could not compensate for Cheney's loss. The friend's recovery could not replace the partner's death. The consolation could not address the devastation. The gift was present alongside the loss, and the loss was larger. Paul walked into the desert. The Fremen tradition required the blind to walk into the desert, to accept the desert's judgment rather than burdening the community with the blind person's dependency. The tradition was ancient, was the cultural practice the desert's conditions had produced across millennia of the desert existence. The communal assessment that the blind person's consumption of the community's resources exceeded what the blind person's contribution could justify. Paul was blind. The prescient vision that had replaced the physical sight was faltering, was losing the clarity the navigation required, was becoming the intermittent awareness rather than the sustained perception the navigation depended on. The faltering was the prescient capability's erosion, the progressive loss of the vision's comprehensiveness that the consciousness's sustained damage had produced. The faltering meant the blindness was becoming real. The prescient navigation that had concealed the blindness, that had made the blind man's functioning indistinguishable from the sighted man's functioning, was failing. The concealment was ending. The blindness was emerging from behind the prescient compensation, becoming the functional reality the compensation had prevented. Paul accepted the tradition. The acceptance was the acceptance of the desert's authority, the blind man's acknowledgement that the desert's judgment was the judgment the tradition required. The recognition that the Fremen customs application to the Emperor was the customs application to the Fremen the Emperor had become. The acceptance was also the departure. The acceptance of the desert walk was the departure from the governance, the prescient consciousness's decision to leave the position the probability space's structure had defined. The person's choice to accept the desert's authority over the body, rather than continuing to accept the probability space's authority over the consciousness. Paul walked out, walked into the desert, walked into the sand that the Fremen's tradition said was the blind person's destination. The Emperor of the known universe, the Kwisatz Haderach, the Muad'Dib. The prescient consciousness, whose awareness had encompassed the probability space's totality, walked into the desert as the blind man the tradition said he was. The walking was the ending, not the death. The saga's later events would suggest that Paul survived the walk, that the desert did not kill the blind man the tradition was supposed to deliver to the desert's judgment, the ending of the governance, the ending of the prescient consciousness's operation in the political landscape's dimension, the ending of the messianic role that the desert walk's acceptance was the final expression of. Paul left the twins, left the governance, left the court, left the political landscape the revolution had created and the 12 years of governance had managed, left the position the prescient consciousness had occupied, and that the consciousness's damage could no longer sustain. The leaving was the release. Not the freedom. The release was not the recovery of the freedom the prescient prison had denied. The release was the evacuation, the departure from the prison rather than the prison's destruction. The consciousness's withdrawal from the position the prison had defined rather than the consciousness's liberation from the position's constraints. The release was also the abdication. The governance was abandoned, was left to the regency that Elia would administer, to the institutional management the governance's political apparatus would provide, to the political dynamics the governance's absence would generate. The abdication was not responsible, was not the careful, managed, institutionally prepared transfer of authority the responsible governance would have conducted. The abdication was the evacuation's consequence, was the product of the departure rather than the design of the transition. The irresponsibility was the prescient consciousness's final assessment. The assessment showed Paul that the regency's consequences, the governance's deterioration, the abomination's risk, the political landscape's destabilization, were less terrible than the governance's continuation under the damaged consciousness's management. The assessment was the least terrible option's final selection, the calculation that the departure's consequences, however significant, were less damaging than the continuance's consequences. The calculation was the prescient consciousness's last governance act. The consciousness assessed. The consciousness selected. The consciousness departed. Paul walked into the desert. The Messiah left the temple. The God walked away from the altar. The most powerful consciousness in human history chose the blind man's walk over the governor's throne. The choosing was the tragedy's resolution, not the happy ending the resolution's dramatic position might suggest, but the recognition that the consciousness's continued operation in the governance's dimension was producing more damage than the consciousness's departure would produce. The resolution was not redemption. The resolution was damage assessment, the final calculation of the least terrible option in a probability space whose every option was terrible. Paul chose the desert. The desert was the least terrible. The desert walk's meaning was the meaning that the tragedy's full development produced, the meaning that the 12 years of governance and the conspiracy's operation and the death and the blindness and the departure's circumstances combined to generate. The meaning was this: the Messiah's power was the Messiah's destruction. The prescient consciousness that had made Paul the most powerful person in human history was the consciousness that had destroyed the person inside the power. The power and the person were incompatible, were occupying the same consciousness in a configuration that the consciousness could not sustain indefinitely, that the 12 years of governance had progressively destabilized, that the conspiracy's operation and the death's devastation and the blindness's dependency had finally made unsustainable. The incompatibility was structural. The prescient power operated through the comprehensive awareness, through the perception of the probability space's totality, through the assessment of every consequence, through the calculation of the least terrible option. The person operated through the personal dimensions, through the emotional attachments, the grief, the love, the hope, the suffering that the human consciousness's architecture produced. The power required the comprehensive awareness. The person required the personal dimensions. The awareness and the dimensions coexisted in the same consciousness, and the coexistence was the strain the consciousness could not indefinitely sustain. The strain was cumulative. Each year of the governance added to the strain's load, added the awareness's moral weight, added the personal dimension's emotional cost, added the coexistence's incompatibilities pressure. The load accumulated. The accumulation produced the damage. The damage progressed. The progression made the governance unsustainable. The desert walk was the strain's resolution, the consciousness's departure from the conditions that produced the strain, the person's withdrawal from the position the power had placed the person in. The resolution was not the healing. The desert walk did not repair the damage the 12 years had produced. The resolution was the departure from the conditions that were producing further damage, the evacuation from the governance's position that was the damage's ongoing source. The tragedy of Paul Atreides in Dune Messiah was the tragedy of capability. Not the tragedy of the incapable, not the tragedy of the person who lacked the power to achieve the objectives the person desired. The tragedy of the capable, the tragedy of the person whose power exceeded the person's capacity to bear the power's consequences, whose capabilities exceeded the person's capacity to endure the capability's costs. Paul had the power. Paul had more power than any person in human history: the prescient consciousness, the military force, the political authority, the religious devotion. Paul had everything the power's accumulation could provide. Paul also had the power's costs, the awareness of the 61 billion, the jihad's moral weight, the prescient prison's sustained confinement, the conspiracy's emotional erosion, the beloved's death, the blindness, the cumulative damage the power's exercise produced. The costs exceeded the power's benefits. This was the tragedy's accounting. The calculation that the power's costs to the person who possessed it exceeded the power's benefits to the person who exercised it. The power was effective. The governance was competent. The political landscape was managed. The institutional operations functioned. The power worked. The person who possessed the power was destroyed by the possession. The destruction was not the enemy's achievement. The conspiracy contributed to the destruction's mechanics, provided the Goler's emotional weapon, the navigator's prescient concealment, the wife's domestic interference, but the conspiracy did not cause the destruction. The destruction's cause was the power itself, was the prescient consciousness's comprehensive awareness operating across 12 years of sustained governance, producing the cumulative damage the awareness's moral and emotional weight imposed on the person who carried it. The conspiracy accelerated the destruction. The conspiracy did not create the destruction. The destruction was the power's product, was generated by the consciousness's operation in the governance's dimension, was produced by the sustained exercise of the capabilities the consciousness possessed. The destruction would have occurred without the conspiracy, would have been produced by the 12 years accumulation, even if the conspiracy's additional weight had not been added. The conspiracy made the destruction's arrival sooner. The conspiracy did not make the destruction's arrival possible. The arrival was possible because the power was unsustainable. The unsustainability was the tragedy's deepest dimension. The power the breeding program had produced, the Kwisatz Haderach, the prescient consciousness, the most capable mind in human history, was power the human consciousness could not sustain. The power was too much for the person. The awareness was too comprehensive for the emotional architecture. The moral weight was too heavy for the psychological structure. The human consciousness was not designed for the prescient awareness's scope, and the scope's imposition on the consciousness produced the damage the consciousness could not repair. The Bene Gesserit had intended to manage the Kwisatz Haderach. The Sisterhood's breeding program had been designed to produce the prescient consciousness within the institutional framework the Sisterhood controlled. The management was supposed to provide the support the consciousness needed for the power's sustainable operation, the institutional structure, the training protocols, the guided development that would have produced the prescient capability within the conditions the capability's sustainable exercise required. Paul arrived outside the management. The Kwisatz Haderach's premature arrival, 1 generation early, through Jessica's disobedience, produced the prescient consciousness without the institutional management the Sisterhood's design specified. The consciousness developed in the desert was shaped by the Fremen's conditions rather than by the Sisterhood's protocols, was formed by the environmental pressures rather than by the institutional cultivation. The unmanaged development might have been the tragedy's contributing factor. The institutional management the Sisterhood's design specified might have produced a more sustainable consciousness, might have developed the prescient capability within a framework that supported the capability's exercise without the damage the unmanaged exercise produced. The might is conditional. The Sisterhood's management might not have been sufficient. The prescient consciousness might have exceeded the institutional framework regardless of the framework's design. The conditionality is the saga's acknowledgement that the management's adequacy was untested, that the Sisterhood's institutional design for the Kwisatz Haderach was a theory rather than a demonstration, a plan rather than a practice. The theory's untested character left the question open. Would the managed Kwisatz Haderach have been sustainable? Would the institutional framework have provided the support the consciousness needed? Would the Sisterhood's cultivation have produced the prescient capability without the damage the unmanaged capability produced? The question was Paul's tragedy's open dimension, the dimension that the tragedy's resolution did not close, the possibility that the destruction might have been avoided if the circumstances had been different. Paul's desert walk was the Dune saga's most sustained argument against the messianic principle, the demonstration, conducted through the Messiah's own experience that the messianic role was destructive to the person who filled it. The argument was not abstract. The argument was personal, was conducted through the documentation of Paul's experience, through the narrative's sustained attention to the person inside the power, through the rendering of the consciousness's damage with the detail the damage's significance required. The argument said, the Messiah is destroyed by the role. The power the role provides, the prescient awareness, the political authority, the religious devotion, is power that exceeds the person's capacity to bear. The bearing destroys the bearer. The destruction is not the enemy's work. The destruction is the role's work, is produced by the role's demands on the person who fills the role. The argument extended beyond Paul to the messianic principle itself. The argument said, the principle is the problem. The principle that one person can bear the responsibility for the civilization's direction, can carry the weight of the decisions the civilization's governance requires, can sustain the awareness of the decision's consequences, can endure the moral cost the decision's implementation produces, is a principle that overestimates the person and underestimates the cost. The overestimation was the breeding program's error. The Bene Gesserit designed the Kwisatz Haderach to be the person who could bear the responsibility. The design produced the capability. The design did not produce the durability, did not produce the psychological structure that could sustain the capability's exercise without the damage the exercise imposed. The underestimation was the civilization's error. The civilization that accepted the Messiah, that worshipped the Muad'Dib, that followed the Lisan al-Gaib, that organized its institutional life around the prescient consciousness's direction, underestimated the cost the direction imposed on the director. The civilization received the governance. The civilization did not perceive the governance's cost to the governor. The desert walk was the cost's expression, the physical demonstration of the governance's unsustainability, the visible evidence of the damage the 12 years of prescient governance had produced. The most powerful man in human history walked into the desert as a blind man. The walk was the tragedy's image, the picture of the power's consequence, the visible evidence of what the power did to the person who possessed it. The image was Herbert's argument made visual, the novelist who constructed the Dune saga as the sustained examination of the messianic principles consequences produced. In the desert walk, the image that encapsulated the examination's conclusion. The Messiah walks into the desert. The power's possessor walks away from the power. The God walks away from the temple. The walk is the conclusion. The conclusion was not the end. The saga continued. The twins, the regency, the God Emperor, the Golden Path. The continuation extended the messianic argument into dimensions Paul's tragedy did not encompass, dimensions that Leto II's tragedy would address, that the post-God Emperor landscape would explore. The continuation was the argument's extension. The desert walk was the argument's first conclusion, the first demonstration that the messianic principle destroyed the Messiah. The first demonstration was sufficient. The desert walk said everything the demonstration needed to say. The Messiah is human. The human is mortal. The mortal cannot bear the immortal's burden. The burden destroys the bearer. The destruction is the principle's consequence. Paul Atreides. Muad'Dib. The Kwisatz Haderach, the emperor of the known universe, the blind man walking into the desert, the tragedy of capability, the destruction of the powerful by the power, the Messiah consumed by the messianic role. Dune Messiah told one story. The story was this: the most powerful man in the history of the human species spent 12 years wishing he could not see. And then he could not. And then he walked away. The political landscape of Paul's court was the landscape of a governance whose institutional character reflected the governance's dual nature, the political authority of an emperor and the religious authority of a Messiah combined in a single person whose prescient consciousness managed both dimensions simultaneously. The court was organized around Paul. This was true of every imperial court. The governance's institutional structure was organized around the ruler, and the ruler's person was the structure's center. But Paul's court was organized around Paul in a dimension the Carino dynasty's court had not encompassed, was organized around the prescient consciousness as well as the political authority, was shaped by the awareness the consciousness provided as well as by the governance the authority required. The courtiers navigated two dimensions: the political dimension, the competition for influence, management of alliances, the pursuit of institutional interests that every court's dynamics generated, was the dimension the courtiers' political training had prepared them for. The prescient dimension, the awareness that the person at the court center could see the courtiers' intentions, could perceive the strategies the courtiers were pursuing, could assess the political maneuvering the courtiers were conducting, was the dimension the courtiers' training had not prepared them for. The prescient dimension changed the court's dynamics. The conventional court's politics were conducted behind the facades the political culture maintained, behind the diplomatic presentations, the social performances, the managed appearances that concealed the actual intentions the political competition generated. The prescient consciousness could see through the facades. The consciousness could perceive the intentions the facades concealed. The consciousness could assess the strategies the diplomatic presentations were designed to hide. The transparency the prescience produced was not complete. The navigator's interference created the blind spots the conspiracy exploited. But the transparency was sufficient to change the court's character, to create the awareness among the courtiers that their political activities were conducted in the presence of a consciousness that could perceive the activity's actual character rather than their presented character. The awareness produced caution. The courtiers' political activities were conducted with the restraint the prescient observation imposed, the moderation that the knowledge of the observer's capabilities produced. The restraint was not genuine, was not the expression of the courtier's actual political temperance. The restraint was strategic, was the adaptation to the observation's conditions, the adjustment of the political behavior to the awareness of the observer's capabilities. The strategic restraint was itself visible to the prescient consciousness. Paul could see the restraint. Paul could see the restraint's strategic character, could perceive that the moderation was strategic rather than genuine, that the courtiers were adapting their behavior to the observation's conditions rather than actually moderating their political ambitions. The visibility of the strategic restraint was the court's defining paradox, the paradox of a governance whose observation produced the adaptation the observation could see through. The paradox was exhausting. The court's dynamics, the courtier's strategic restraint, the restraint's visibility, the visibility's assessment, the assessment's management added to the governance's cognitive load. The prescient consciousness managed the court's dynamics alongside the governance's political dimension, the jihad's moral weight, the conspiracy's erosion, the personal dimension's emotional cost. The court's dynamics were another dimension of the comprehensive awareness's content, another category of information the consciousness had to process. Another set of assessments the consciousness had to manage. Stilgar's position in the court was the position that most directly embodied the tension between the political and the religious that Paul's governance produced. Stilgar, the Fremen Naib, whose leadership of Sietch Tabr had provided the institutional framework for Paul's desert period, occupied a position in the court that reflected the Fremen's transformation from the desert civilization into the Imperium's governing population. Stilgar was a military leader. Stilgar was also a believer. The two dimensions, the military capability the Fremen tradition had produced and the religious devotion the messianic identification had generated, coexisted in Stilgar's person. And the coexistence's dynamics were the dynamics the Fremen's transformation produced at the individual level. The military dimension was competent. Stilgar's assessment of military situations, his management of the Fremen's military operations, his navigation of the court's military dimension, all were conducted with the capability the desert's conditions had developed and the governance's demands had refined. The religious dimension was constraining. Stilgar's devotion to the Muad'Dib, the belief in Paul's messianic identity that the Lisan al-Gaib's identification had produced, was the devotion that subordinated Stilgar's independent judgment to Paul's prophetic authority. The subordination was progressive, was deepened across the 12 years of the governance's operation, each year's devotion reducing the independent assessment the following year's devotion replaced. Paul observed the subordination with the grief the observation produced. The prescient consciousness could see Stilgar's independent judgment being consumed by the devotion the messianic identification sustained. The consciousness could see the capable military leader being reduced to the devoted follower, the person whose assessment was being replaced by the worship, whose judgment was being subordinated to the faith. The observation was the messianic role's cost paid by someone other than the Messiah. Stilgar was not destroyed by the power. Stilgar was destroyed by the proximity to the power, by the devotion the power generated in the persons the power was present to. The destruction was not physical. The destruction was the independent person's progressive replacement by the devoted follower, the erosion of the qualities that had made Stilgar a capable leader in the Desert period, replaced by the deference that the messianic identification's 12-year deepening had produced. Paul could see this happening. Paul could not prevent it. The prevention would have required the dismantling of the messianic identification that was producing the devotion, the public repudiation of the Lisanal Gaib's identity that the Fremen's faith was organized around. The repudiation's consequences, visible in the prescient assessment, were worse than the devotion's consequences. The assessment said, "The devotion's erosion of Stilgar's independence is less terrible than the repudiation's disruption of the governance's religious foundation." The assessment was the prescient prison's operation applied to the personal relationship. Paul watched Stilgar's destruction. Paul permitted the destruction because the permitting was the least terrible option. The permitting was another dimension of the damage the governance was accumulating, another person's erosion added to the moral weight the consciousness was carrying. The Fremen's transformation across the 12 years was the civilizational transformation that the messianic mobilization had produced, and the transformation's character illuminated the cost the messianic role imposed on the people who accepted it. The Fremen of the pre-Paul era had been the desert's people, the civilization whose identity was forged by the desert's demands, whose capabilities were the desert's products, whose cultural values reflected the environmental conditions the desert imposed. The Fremen had been hard, had been capable, had been organized around the survival that the desert made the civilization's primary preoccupation. The Fremen of the 12-year governance were the Empire's soldiers. The transformation from the desert's people to the Empire's soldiers was the transformation the messianic mobilization had produced, the conversion of the survival-oriented civilization into the conquest-oriented military force, the redirection of the desert's capabilities from the defense of the Sietch to the conquest of the universe. The conversion consumed the original identity. The Fremen, who had been the desert's people, who had valued the water discipline, who had maintained the Sietch communities, who had practiced the survival arts the desert demanded, were becoming the Empire's administrators, the governance's functionaries, the institutional operators the Imperium's management required. The conversion was not complete. The Fremen retained elements of the original identity, maintained the cultural practices the governance's conditions permitted, but the conversion's direction was clear, was moving from the desert identity toward the imperial identity, from the survival culture toward the governance culture. The wealth was the conversion's most visible mechanism. The jihad's conquests had produced wealth, the plunder, the tribute, the economic rewards the conquering army's activities generated. The wealth was distributed among the Fremen, was shared through the communal mechanisms the Fremen's culture maintained for the distribution of the community's resources. The distribution introduced material conditions the desert had never provided, introduced the abundance that the desert's scarcity had defined the culture against. The abundance threatened the identity. The water discipline, the cultural practice that defined the Fremen more than any other practice, was made unnecessary by the abundance the wealth provided. The discipline had been organized around the water's scarcity. The wealth eliminated the scarcity. The elimination made the discipline unnecessary. The unnecessary practice was progressively abandoned, was maintained in the ceremonial dimension, but was progressively reduced in the practical dimension that the practice's cultural significance depended on. Paul observed the transformation with the awareness the prescient vision provided. The consciousness could see the conversion's trajectory, could see the desert identity's progressive consumption by the imperial identity, could see the cultural practices' progressive abandonment, as the abundance, the wealth provided, made the practices' survival functions unnecessary. The observation was another dimension of the tragedy. Paul had mobilized the Fremen. The mobilization had produced the jihad. The jihad had produced the wealth. The wealth was consuming the identity the mobilization had deployed. The chain of causation ran from Paul's acceptance of the messianic role through the mobilization, through the jihad, through the wealth, through the identity's consumption. Paul was at the chain's beginning. The identity's consumption was at the chain's end. The consumption was another cost. The 61 billion dead were one cost. The Fremen's identity's consumption was another. The messianic role's costs accumulated, were produced in every dimension the role's consequences reached, were generated by every chain of causation the role's acceptance had initiated. Irulan's experience of the conspiracy was the experience of a participant whose motivations were the most personal of the conspiracy's institutional participants, and whose position was the most precarious. Irulan was trained. The Bene Gesserit training she had received, the observational capabilities, the analytical assessment, the political management skills the sisterhood's tradition provided, gave her the capabilities the conspiracy's participation required. The capabilities were deployed in the conspiracy's service, were used for the assessment of the governance's vulnerabilities, the management of the domestic activities the conspiracy's personal dimension required, the maintenance of the contraceptive administration the conspiracy's ongoing operation depended on. Irulan was also suffering. The position's personal emptiness, the emperor's wife without the emperor's partnership, the political instrument without the political participation, was the sustained experience the 12 years of governance had imposed. The suffering was not dramatic, was not the catastrophic crisis the suffering's dramatic presentation would have produced. The suffering was sustained, was the ongoing daily accumulated experience of the position's personal deficit. The suffering was the motivation's source. Irulan participated in the conspiracy because the suffering produced the motivation the participation required, produced the willingness to act against the governance the suffering's conditions had generated, produced the risk acceptance the conspiracy's activities demanded. The participation was also the Bene Gesserit's instrument. Irulan was trained by the sisterhood. The training's institutional loyalty, the attachment to the sisterhood's institutional purposes that the training instilled, oriented the participation toward the sisterhood's interests alongside Irulan's personal interests. The participation served both, served the personal interest in the position's improvement and the institutional interest in the governance's management. The discovery's consequences were the consequences Irulan's position most depended on. Paul knew about the contraceptive administration. The discovery was not a dramatic revelation, was not the sudden exposure that the discovery's narrative position might suggest. The discovery was the prescient consciousness's awareness, the sustained knowledge the prescient vision had provided across the years of the administration's operation. Paul's response to the discovery was the response the prescient assessment's least terrible option calculation produced. The response was contained, was managed within the political framework the governance maintained, was addressed through the mechanisms the political calculation identified as least damaging. The response was not punitive, was not the dramatic punishment the betrayal's severity might have suggested. The response was political, was calibrated to the political consequences the response would produce, rather than to the moral assessment the betrayal warranted. Irulan survived. She survived because the political calculation determined she was more useful alive than punished, because the Corino connection the marriage represented was more valuable maintained than the satisfaction of the punishment would have provided. The survival was political rather than personal, was the product of the calculation rather than the product of forgiveness. Edric's experience of the conspiracy was the experience of the institutional participant whose contribution was the most consequential and whose personal experience of the contribution was the most alien to the ordinary human experience. Edric was a navigator, the spice transformed being whose prescient perception guided the ships through fold space was the being whose prescient field provided the conspiracy's tactical concealment. Edric existed in the navigation tank, in the spice-saturated environment the navigator's function required, separated from the ordinary human experience the non-navigators maintained. Edric's participation was institutional rather than personal. The navigator's motivation was the guild's motivation, the institutional interest in the spice supplies management that the guild's survival depended on. Edric did not participate because of personal grievance or personal ambition. Edric participated because the Guild's institutional assessment concluded that the conspiracy's success served the Guild's institutional interests. The institutional character of Edric's participation made the participation the most cold-blooded of the conspiracy's components, the most thoroughly calculated, the most completely organized around the institutional assessment rather than the personal motivation. The Tlilax participated with the institutional purpose and the cultural secrecy the Tlilax tradition provided. Irulan participated with the personal suffering the position's emptiness produced. Edric participated with the institutional calculation the Guild's analytical tradition generated. The calculation was correct. The Guild's interests were served by the conspiracy's purposes, the purposes that included the reduction of Paul's personal control over the spice supply, the redistribution of the spice management through institutional mechanisms the Guild could influence. The calculation was also limited, was bounded by the institutional perspective the calculation was conducted from, was unable to encompass the dimensions of the conspiracy's consequences the institutional perspective did not include. Edric's prescient field was the conspiracy's most consequential contribution, and the contribution Edric could provide without the personal engagement the other participants' contributions required. The field was passive, was the product of Edric's existence rather than of Edric's action, was generated by the navigator's presence rather than by the navigator's effort. Edric's contribution was the contribution of being, of existing in the proximity to the conspiracy's operations, of providing the prescient interference the existence generated. The passivity was characteristic. The navigator's contribution was the navigator's existence's product, the thing the navigator provided by being what the navigator was rather than by doing what the navigator chose to do. The distinction between being and doing was the distinction that the navigator's institutional role was organized around. The navigator existed to navigate, and the navigation was the product of the existence rather than of the action. The meaning of the hate goaler's recovery of Duncan Idaho's personality was the meaning that connected the conspiracy's unintended consequence to the saga's argument about identity and the relationship between the biological substrate and the conscious self. The recovery demonstrated that the personality was preserved in the biology, that the biological memory the goaler's body contained included the informational substrate from which the original personality could be reconstructed. The demonstration was consequential for the saga's argument about the relationship between the body and the self, suggested that the self was encoded in the biology at a level that the biology's death did not eliminate, that the biological substrate carried the self's potential regardless of the self's conscious presence. The recovery also demonstrated that the potential's activation required the emotional conditions, that the personality's reconstruction was not a mechanical process that Lilacs's technology could initiate, but an emotional process the circumstances had to provide. The emotional crisis the conspiracy's events produced, the death, the birth, the convergence of the personal and the political dimensions' most intense expressions, was the crisis the activation required. The crisis provided the emotional conditions. The conditions activated the potential. The activation recovered the personality. The recovery was the conspiracy's gift to Paul, the unintended product of the conspiracy's operation that provided the return the conspiracy's design was supposed to deny. The gift was real. Duncan was returned, was present, was the person whose loyalty and whose friendship Paul had lost, and whose loss the Golar's presence had continuously reopened. The return was the emotional consolation the crisis's devastation permitted, the recovery that accompanied the loss, the restoration that accompanied the destruction. The gift's insufficiency was the tragedy's measure. Duncan's return could not compensate for Cheney's death. The friend's recovery could not replace the partner's loss. The consolation could not address the devastation. The gift was present. The gift was insufficient. The insufficiency was the tragedy's accounting of what the power had cost the person who possessed it. The twins' significance was the significance of the future the tragedy produced, the children whose birth accompanied the mother's death, and whose existence would carry the saga's narrative into the dimensions Paul's governance could not reach. Leto and Ganima were pre-born. The consciousness that the genetics and the environmental conditions had produced, the awareness of the ancestral presences, the access to other memory, the prescient potential the genetic configuration provided, was the consciousness that the twins carried from the moment of their delivery. The twins were Paul's legacy, not the governance's legacy. The governance's legacy was the institutional apparatus the Regency would administer and the political dynamics the governance's absence would generate. The twins were Paul's personal legacy, the children whose existence was the personal dimension's product, whose genetics carried Paul's contribution alongside Chani's contribution, whose consciousness would develop in the conditions the post-Paul landscape provided. The twins were also Chani's legacy. The children whose birth killed the mother were the mother's biological continuation, the persons whose existence was the partnership's product, whose consciousness carried the partner's contribution alongside the governance's contribution. Cheney's death was not the end. Chani's death was the transformation, the conversion of the living partner into the biological legacy the children's existence constituted. The conversion was the childbirth's biological reality, the exchange the biological process enacted, the mother's death accompanying the children's delivery. The reality was not symbolic. The reality was biological, was the physical process through which the living person became the genetic contribution the children's existence carried forward. The twins' pre-born consciousness would carry the saga forward into Children of Dune, into the crisis of the Regency, the Abomination's realization, the Golden Path's identification, the God Emperor's transformation. The twins were the bridge, the persons whose existence connected Paul's governance to Leto II's governance, whose consciousness carried the prescient potential across the generation the transition required. The bridge was built on the tragedy. The twins' existence was the tragedy's product, was produced through the mechanisms the tragedy's events generated. was carried into the future by the children whose birth the tragedy's most devastating event accompanied. The future was the tragedy's product. The product was the continuation. The continuation was the tragedy's meaning. The tragedy produced the future. The future required the tragedy's cost. The cost was paid by the persons the tragedy consumed, by Chani, whose death the childbirth produced, by Paul, whose destruction the governance's weight accumulated, by the Fremen, whose identity the mobilization's wealth consumed, by the 61 billion, whose deaths the jihad's momentum produced. The cost was paid. The future was produced. The production's moral accounting was the accounting the saga left for the reader, the assessment of whether the future's value justified the cost's magnitude, the evaluation of whether the continuation's benefit compensated for the destruction's devastation. The assessment was the reader's. The saga presented the cost and the product and left the assessment to the consciousness the reader brought to the evaluation. Paul walked into the desert. The twins remained. The future continued. The tragic fate of Paul Atreides in Dune Messiah was the fate of the person consumed by the role the person had accepted. The consumption was comprehensive, consumed the person's sight, the person's partnership, the person's governance, the person's position. The consumption left the legacy, left the children, the recovered friend, the institutional apparatus, the political landscape. The legacy was the tragedy's product. The tragedy was the legacy's cost. Paul paid the cost. The legacy endured. The blind man walked into the desert. The twins' eyes opened. The saga continued. The prescient consciousness's internal experience was the dimension the saga's narrative rendered with the sustained attention the experience's significance required, and examining the experience illuminates the tragedy's psychological architecture. The internal experience was not ordinary thought. The prescient consciousness did not process information the way the ordinary consciousness processed information, did not receive data, analyze the data, produce conclusions through the sequential assessment the ordinary cognitive function employed. The prescient consciousness perceived, apprehended the probability space's structure through the direct awareness the prescient capability provided, encountered the future's branching possibilities as the immediate content of the consciousness's perceptual field. The immediacy was the experience's defining quality. The futures the consciousness perceived were not abstract, were not the theoretical possibilities the analytical assessment would have generated. The futures were present, were experienced with the perceptual immediacy that the present moment's experience provided, were felt with the vividness the direct perception produced. The consciousness did not think about the future. The consciousness saw the future. The seeing was as immediate as the seeing of the present. The immediacy made the suffering immediate. The jihad's 61 billion dead were not an abstract count in the prescient consciousness's awareness. The deaths were perceived, were seen with the directness the prescient perception provided, were experienced as the immediate content of the consciousness's perceptual field. The consciousness perceived the deaths the way the ordinary consciousness perceived the events occurring in the person's physical presence, with the vividness, the detail, the emotional impact that the direct perception generated. The sustained perception of the deaths was the moral weight's mechanism. The consciousness did not carry the 61 billion as a number. The consciousness carried the 61 billion as a perception, as the direct, vivid, emotionally impactful awareness of what the number contained. The carrying was the weight. The weight was the damage's source. The damage operated through the emotional architecture the consciousness possessed. The prescient consciousness was a human consciousness, was built on the neurological architecture the human brain's evolution had produced, was equipped with the emotional response systems the human experience's demands had generated. The architecture was designed for the ordinary perceptual field, for the processing of the events the ordinary consciousness encountered in the ordinary experience's limited scope. The architecture was not designed for the prescient perceptual field, for the processing of the events the prescient consciousness encountered in the prescient experience's comprehensive scope. The mismatch between the architecture's design and the perception scope was the damage's mechanism. The emotional response systems that could process the ordinary experience's limited content could not process the prescient experience's comprehensive content. The systems were overwhelmed, were loaded beyond the capacity the design's parameters encompassed, were required to process the emotional content of 61 billion deaths through the mechanisms that the design had calibrated for the emotional content of the ordinary experience's limited encounters. The overwhelm was cumulative. Each day's prescient perception added to the system's load, added the emotional content the day's probability space's assessment generated, added the suffering the day's assessment encompassed. The load accumulated. The system's capacity did not increase. The accumulation eventually exceeded the capacity the systems possessed. The exceeding was the damage. The emotional response systems, loaded beyond their design's capacity, operated under the stress the overload produced, generated the responses the overload's conditions forced, produced the emotional states the overloaded processing created. The states were not the states the ordinary experience produced. The states were the states the extraordinary load generated. The emotional responses of systems operating beyond the parameters the response's design had specified. Paul experienced the states as the governance's personal dimension. The states were present in the awareness with the emotional content the consciousness carried alongside the prescient perception's cognitive content. The states colored the governance, influenced the decisions the governance required, affected the assessments the governance's management produced, shaped the responses the governance's events generated. The colouring was the damage's expression. The governance that was conducted through the damaged emotional systems was governance that was influenced by the damage, was governance whose decisions carried the emotional weight the damage produced, whose assessments were shaped by the emotional states the overloaded systems generated. The Korba dimension of the Dune Messiah narrative was the dimension that connected the conspiracy's institutional operation to the Kizerate's internal dynamics, and that illuminated the religious institution's relationship with the governance the institution was supposed to serve. Korba was a figure within the Kizerate's leadership, a person whose position in the religious institution gave the person access to the institutional mechanisms the Kizerate's operations encompassed. Korba's involvement in the conspiracy was the involvement of a religious institution's officer in the institutional conspiracy against the governance the institution served. The involvement's motivation was the motivation the institutional dynamics produced, the assessment that the governance's continuation served the institution's interests less effectively than the governance's modification would. The calculation that the conspiracy's success would produce the institutional conditions the officer's assessment of the institution's interests preferred. The calculation was the Kizerate's institutional character made personal, the institutional dynamics expression in the individual's assessment of the individual's institutional interests. The calculation was not heroic. The calculation was institutional, was the product of the institutional dynamics operation on the individual's assessment, was generated by the institutional culture's influence on the person's evaluation of the person's interests. The Stone Burners deployment was the dimension of Korba's involvement that exceeded the institutional calculations parameters. The weapons deployment, the escalation from the conspiracy's sub-threshold operation to the crisis-level confrontation the weapon's destructive capability produced, was the dimension that the institutional calculation had not encompassed. The consequence that the calculation's institutional parameters had not anticipated. The deployment's consequences, Paul's blinding, the destruction's physical impact, the crisis the deployment produced, were consequences the institutional calculation had not included in the calculation's assessment. The deployment exceeded the calculation. The consequences exceeded the calculation's parameters. The excess was the conspiracy's uncontrolled dimension. The dimension that the institutional planning had not managed, and that the deployment's escalation generated. The face dancer infiltration was the conspiracy's most covert dimension. The deployment of the Bene Tleilax's shape-shifting operatives in the governance's institutional landscape, providing the intelligence the conspiracy's operation required and the operational capability the conspiracy's activities demanded. The face dancers operated in the governance's institutional spaces, occupied the positions the governance's operational requirements created, performed the functions the positions specified, maintained the cover the shape-shifting capability provided. The operative's presence was invisible to the governance's observation, was concealed behind the appearances the shape-shifting generated, was maintained without the detection the governance's security mechanisms were designed to provide. The invisibility was the face dancer's contribution to the conspiracy's concealment, was the operational covertness that supplemented the navigator's prescient concealment. The navigator concealed the conspiracy from the prescient perception. The face dancers concealed the conspiracy's operatives from the physical observation. The two concealments operated in different dimensions, the prescient and the physical, and the combination provided the comprehensive concealment the conspiracy's sustained operation required. Paul's awareness of the face dancer's presence was the awareness the prescient vision partially provided. The perception that the governance's institutional landscape included the infiltrated operatives whose identity the prescient vision could detect in the dimensions the navigator's interference did not conceal. The awareness was partial, was limited by the navigator's interference to the general detection rather than the operational detail the full prevention would have required. The partial awareness was another dimension of the prescient prison's frustration. The consciousness could detect the infiltration's existence without identifying the infiltration's operatives, could perceive the threat's presence without locating the threat's source. The detection and the inability to act on the detection were the prescient consciousness's characteristic experience. The awareness that provided the perception without the capacity for the perception's application. Elia's position in the Dune Messiah period was the position that foreshadowed the role the Regency would eventually assign her, and that the abomination's risk would eventually compromise. Elia was a child of the court, was the Emperor's sister, was the pre-born consciousness whose capabilities exceeded what her age permitted. Elia occupied a position in the court that was simultaneously privileged and anomalous, privileged by the relationship to the Emperor, anomalous by the pre-born condition that made the young woman's consciousness older than any adults in the court. Elia's pre-born condition was present throughout the Dune Messiah period, was the condition that the later novels would develop into the Abomination crisis, was the vulnerability that the ancestral presences in other memory would eventually exploit. The condition's presence in the Dune Messiah period was the condition's incubation, the period during which the risk was present without the risk's realization, during which the vulnerability existed without the vulnerability's exploitation. The Baron's presence was there. The ancestral personality that would eventually dominate Elia's consciousness was present in the other memory the pre-born condition accessed, was among the presences the consciousness contained, was waiting with the strategic patience the living Baron had demonstrated. The waiting was the Dune Messiah period's contribution to the abomination narrative, the period during which the patient presence was accumulating the influence the later novels would document. Paul was aware of the risk. The prescient consciousness could perceive the abomination's trajectory, could see the path the preborn condition's vulnerability was developing along, could assess the probability of the ancestral displacement the vulnerability made possible. The awareness was another dimension of the prescient prison's helpless knowledge, another future the consciousness could see and could not prevent. Paul's relationship with the Fremen religion was the relationship that the tragedy's personal dimension most directly encompassed, the relationship between the Messiah and the faith the messianic identification had produced. Paul did not believe. This is the fact that the Fremen's religious devotion obscured, the fact that the Messiah the faith was organized around did not share the faith the organization sustained. Paul did not believe in the Lisan al-Gaib's prophecy. Paul knew the prophecy was manufactured, knew the Missionaria Protectiva had installed the religious elements the prophecy consisted of, knew the prophecy was the product of the Bene Gesserit's institutional engineering rather than the expression of the desert's spiritual tradition. The knowledge was present in the prescient consciousness alongside the prescient consciousness's awareness of the prophecy's function. The prophecy worked. The manufactured religion produced real effects, produced the devotion the governance depended on, produced the loyalty the military force was built on, produced the institutional support the Imperium's administration required. The prophecy's manufactured character did not reduce the prophecy's functional effectiveness. The manufacture and the effectiveness coexisted, the engineering's product performing the spiritual function the engineering was designed to produce. Paul's relationship with the manufactured prophecy was the relationship of the person who knew the manufacturer's mechanics and who benefited from the manufacturer's product. The relationship was dishonest, was the sustained presentation of the messianic identity the person knew was manufactured, the maintained performance of the prophetic role the person knew was engineered. The dishonesty was not Paul's choice, was not the decision to deceive the faithful for the deception's benefit. The dishonesty was the prescient assessment's product, was the continued performance of the role whose abandonment the assessment identified as more terrible than the performance's continuation. The dishonesty was another dimension of the prescient prison's moral weight. The consciousness that carried the 61 billion deaths awareness also carried the awareness of the faith's manufacture, also carried the knowledge that the devotion the faithful expressed was devotion to a manufactured identity, that the worship the Fremen maintained was worship of an engineered prophecy, that the religion the Kizariti administered was a religion whose foundations were institutional rather than spiritual. The knowledge was corrosive. The sustained awareness of the dishonesty, the 12 years of maintained performance, the 12 years of presented identity the person knew was manufactured, eroded the consciousness's integrity in the dimension the honesty's maintenance depended on. The erosion was another dimension of the damage, another contribution to the cumulative impairment the 12 years of governance produced. The Desert Walk's aftermath, the events the walk produced in the governance's landscape, was the aftermath the tragedy's resolution generated in the political dimension the resolution affected. Paul's departure left the governance without the prescient consciousness. The departure was not a transition. was not the managed, institutionally prepared transfer of authority the responsible governance would have conducted. The departure was an evacuation, the consciousness's withdrawal from the position the damage made unsustainable, executed without the institutional preparation the transition would have required. The Regency assumed the governance. Alia, the pre-born sister, whose capabilities the court's anomalous position had developed, assumed the regent's position, managing the Imperium's governance during the interregnum the departure produced. The assumption was the institutional response to the departure's institutional crisis, the governance's apparatus identifying the person the crisis required and installing the person in the position the crisis created. The Regency's assumption was the tragedy's institutional consequence, the political product of the personal destruction the 12 years had produced. The governance that Paul could no longer sustain was the governance that Alia would have to sustain, and the Alia who assumed the governance was the Alia whose pre-born condition made the abominations risk the governance's latent dimension. The twin infants remained, the children whose birth had accompanied the mother's death and whose father had walked into the desert. The children whose pre-born consciousness carried the prescient potential the genetics provided were the governance's institutional future. The twins were the Regency's purpose, the persons whose maturation the Regency was designed to provide the time for, the heirs whose eventual assumption of the governance the Regency was supposed to prepare. The future was present in the twins' infancy. The prescient potential, the ancestral presences, the genetic configuration the breeding program had produced, all were present in the consciousness the twins carried from the moment of their delivery. The future was not approaching the twins. The future was inside the twins, was the content of the consciousness the twins possessed, was the awareness that the twins' pre-born condition had activated. The twins' future would unfold in Children of Dune, would develop through the crisis of the Regency's deterioration, the abomination's realization, the Golden Path's identification, the transformation that Leto II would undertake. The twins' future was the saga's continuation. The continuation was the tragedy's product. The Dune Messiah period's final accounting, the assessment of what the tragedy produced and what the tragedy consumed, was the accounting the period's events made possible and that the period's narrative required. The tragedy consumed Paul, the person who had been the Caladan heir, the desert warrior, the Kwisatz Haderach, the emperor, the person whose 12 years of governance had been 12 years of prescient imprisonment, was consumed by the role the person had filled. The consumption was comprehensive, consumed the site, the partnership, the governance, the position that the person had occupied. The tragedy consumed Chani, the partner whose companionship had sustained the person through the desert years and the governance years, was consumed by the mechanisms the conspiracy and the governance's dynamics had produced, the contraceptive interference's consequences, the crisis pregnancy's complications, the childbirth's medical failure. The tragedy consumed Stilgar. Not physically, Stilgar survived the period's events. Spiritually, the independent judgment the desert years had valued was consumed by the devotion the messianic identification had produced, the capable leader reduced to the devoted follower by the 12 years' progressive subordination. The tragedy consumed the Fremen's identity. The desert culture's practices and values were consumed by the wealth the jihad produced. The abundance replacing the scarcity the identity was organized around, the imperial identity replacing the desert identity the conditions had created. The tragedy produced the twins, the children whose consciousness carried the prescient potential and the ancestral presences, the children whose existence was the tragedy's biological product and whose future was the saga's continuation. The tragedy produced the recovered Duncan, the friend whose body the conspiracy had provided as a weapon and whose personality the crisis had recovered. The person whose return was the conspiracy's unintended gift to the person the conspiracy was designed to destroy. The tragedy produced the question. The question the saga's construction embedded in the tragedy's narrative, and that the tragedy's events made unavailable to the simple answer, was the messianic role worth the cost? Was the prescient consciousness's governance worth the governance's destruction of the governor? Was the 61 billion deaths path worth the path's inclusion of the least terrible options assessment? Was the power worth the power's cost to the person who possessed it? The question was the saga's question. Was the question Herbert embedded in the narrative's construction, and that the narrative's events made available to the reader's assessment? The question was not answered. The question was posed, was constructed through the tragedy's sustained documentation, was generated by the narrative's rendering of the cost and the product, was presented for the reader's consciousness to address. The reader's consciousness was the consciousness the prohibition was designed to protect, was the human awareness, the moral judgment, the conscious assessment that the saga's argument said the machines would take from the species if the species permitted the taking. The reader's consciousness was invited to perform the assessment the tragedy's question required, to bring the judgment, the awareness, the moral evaluation that the human consciousness provided to the evaluation the tragedy's accounting demanded. The invitation was the saga's gift. The tragedy was the gift's content. The assessment was the gift's purpose. Paul walked into the desert. The reader assessed the walking. The assessment was the thing Paul could not do. The assessment required the distance the prescient consciousness could not produce, required the perspective the comprehensive awareness did not provide, required the judgment that the consciousness trapped inside the probability space could not achieve. Paul could see everything. Paul could not assess what the seeing cost. The reader could assess. The reader was invited to assess. The tragic fate of Paul Atreides in Dune Messiah, the Messiah's destruction by the messianic role, the power's cost to the person who possessed it. The blind man walking into the desert, leaving the twins, leaving the governance, leaving the faith, walking into the sand, walking away from the throne. Walking, Paul's prescient experiences in the Dune Messiah period included moments of clarity that the narrative documented with the attention the moment's significance required, moments in which the probability space's structure was perceived with the vividness the prescient awareness brought to its most intense operations. The oracular visions were the experiences that connected the prescient perception to the governance's decision-making. The visions occurred in the moments when the probability space's structure was shifting, when the events the space encompassed were reorganizing the space's branching possibilities in response to the choices the event's participants were making. The shifting produced the vision's intensity, produced the perceptual experience in which the future's branching was visible with the clarity the perception's most acute operation provided. The visions showed Paul the jihad's ongoing consequences, the killing that was continuing, the worlds being consumed, the populations being subjected to the Fremen's evangelical violence. The resistance being crushed by the military force the messianic mobilization had produced. The killing was present in the visions with the immediacy the prescient perception provided, was not the abstract knowledge of distant events, but the direct awareness of the event's experiential content. The visions showed Paul the conspiracy's operation. The blurred awareness, the perception of the conspiracy's existence behind the navigator's prescient interference was present in the visions alongside the jihad's consequences, was another dimension of the probability space's content that the vision's intensity rendered visible. The conspiracy was there. The conspiracy's content was concealed. The presence without the content was the prescient frustration the navigator's contribution produced. The visions showed Paul Charney's death. The approaching event, the moment whose inevitability the probability space's structure demonstrated, was present in the visions with the clarity the prescient perception brought to the events the space identified as structurally determined. The death was approaching. The death was unavoidable. The visions showed the approach with the directness that made the approach's awareness the consciousness's most sustained suffering. The vision's accumulation was the prescient experience's temporal dimension. The visions did not occur once. The visions occurred repeatedly. With a recurring experience of the prescient consciousness's engagement with the probability space's content, the repeated encounter with the space's structure that the consciousness's ongoing operation produced. Each vision added to the accumulation. Each vision's content was added to the consciousness's experiential load. The load grew. The load's growth was the damage's progression. The water rings ceremony was the cultural practice that connected Paul's governance to the Fremen tradition's most consequential ritual, the practice whose cultural significance the governance's political dimension had not eliminated. Water rings were the Fremen's tribute to the dead. The ceremonial accounting of the water the deceased's body contributed to the Sietch's reserves. The rings, small metallic tokens whose weight corresponded to the water the dead person's body had provided, were maintained by the surviving community as the memorial the cultural practice sustained. Paul's water rings were the rings of the people Paul's governance had produced the deaths of, the memorial tokens that the cultural practice assigned to the deaths the governance's consequences generated. The rings were present in Paul's domestic space, were maintained in the governance's personal dimension as the physical expression of the death's accounting the cultural practice required. The ring's presence was another dimension of the moral weight. The physical tokens, the small metallic objects whose cultural significance the Fremen tradition invested with the weight of the deaths they represented, were present alongside Paul's daily existence, were the tangible reminders of the deaths the governance was producing, were the cultural practice's expression of the killing's ongoing reality. The rings accumulated. Each death the governance produced was another ring. Each ring was another weight. The accumulation was the moral weight's physical expression, the growing collection of tokens whose aggregate represented the aggregate of the deaths the governance's consequences generated. Paul lived among the rings. The rings were part of the governance's domestic dimension, part of the personal space the governance's personal experience was conducted in. The living among was the moral weight's most intimate expression, the sustained proximity to the physical evidence of the deaths the consciousness carried in the prescient awareness's perceptual content. The comparison between Paul's messianic experience and the historical messianic traditions the saga's readers inhabited was the comparison Herbert embedded in the narrative's construction, the connection between the fictional Messiah's destruction and the patterns the historical messianic traditions documented. The historical pattern was this: the Messiah is destroyed by the role. The person who fills the messianic position, the person whose capabilities or whose identification activates the messianic expectation the culture maintains, is consumed by the role's demands. The consumption is the pattern's recurring element, is present across the historical tradition's variations, is the common feature that the variation's diversity does not eliminate. Herbert's Paul was the pattern's most comprehensive rendering. the fictional expression of the historical pattern conducted with the narrative's sustained attention to the consumption's mechanics. The mechanics were documented: the prescient prison's operation, the moral weight's accumulation, the emotional erosion the governance produced. The documentation was the saga's contribution to the messianic argument, the sustained, detailed, narratively grounded examination of what the messianic role did to the person who filled it. The examination's conclusion, the desert walk, was the conclusion the historical pattern's logic produced. The Messiah's departure from the role, the abandonment of the position the role defined, was the conclusion that the role's unsustainability generated. The departure was not the historical pattern's universal conclusion. Some historical traditions documented the Messiah's death rather than the Messiah's departure, but the departure was the conclusion the prescient consciousness's awareness made available, the option the awareness identified when the awareness's assessment of the role's continuation concluded that the continuation's damage exceeded the departure's cost. The Desert Walk was Herbert's commentary on the messianic pattern. The fictional expression of the argument that the messianic role was structurally destructive to the person who filled it, that the destruction was the role's product rather than the enemy's achievement, that the person's departure was the rational response to the role's unsustainability. Bijaz, the Tleilax dwarf, whose role in the conspiracy's operational dimension connected the Gola program to the conspiracy's execution, was the figure whose presence in the narrative illuminated the Tleilax's institutional character in its most personal expression. Bijaz was a Tleilax operative, a person whose capabilities included the programming capacity the Tleilax's biological engineering provided. Bijaz could program the Gola, could install the behavioral directives the conspiracy required, the instructions that would direct the Gola's actions at the moments the conspiracy's timeline specified. The programming was biological rather than mechanical, was conducted through the biological mechanisms the Tleilax's tradition had developed rather than through the computational mechanisms the prohibition forbade. The biological programming raised the prohibition's boundary question in the Gola's context. The programming of a person's behavior through biological mechanisms, the installation of behavioral directives through the biological engineering's techniques, was the programming that the prohibition's language did not clearly address. The prohibition forbade machines in the likeness of human minds. The programming's biological character placed the programming outside the prohibition's mechanical scope. The programming's functional character, the installation of directives that controlled the person's behavior, placed the programming inside the prohibition's functional concern. Bijaz's role was the role of the programmer, the person who installed the directives the conspiracy required in the Gola's biological systems. The installation was covert, was conducted without the governance's detection, was maintained behind the conspiracy's concealment mechanisms. The installation was also the Gola's deepest violation, the subversion of the biological person's autonomy through the biological mechanisms the Tleilax tradition had refined. The violation connected Bijaz to the axolotl tank's exploitation, connected the programming's subversion of autonomy to the tank's elimination of autonomy, demonstrated the Tleilax tradition's consistent institutional character across the dimensions the tradition's biological engineering encompassed. The tradition treated persons as programmable, treated the biological systems the persons consisted of as the substrates the programming could be installed in. The treatment was the tradition's defining moral failure, the failure to recognize the biological person's autonomy as the constraint the programming should not transgress. The political dynamics that produced the conspiracy were the dynamics of a political landscape whose institutional actors were responding to the governance the revolution had imposed. the sustained institutional assessment that the governance's continuation was producing conditions the institutional actors could not accommodate. The political dynamics were not heroic. The conspiracy's participants were not the resistance's heroes, were not the principled opponents of tyranny whose struggle against the unjust governance the heroic narrative would have described. The conspiracy's participants were institutional actors, were the representatives of the institutional interests the governance's continuation threatened, were the persons whose institutional positions produced the motivations the conspiracy's participation required. The institutional character of the motivations was the conspiracy's most consequential quality. The conspiracy was not personal, was not the expression of the participants' personal grievances against Paul. The conspiracy was institutional, was the expression of the institutional interests the governance's continuation threatened, was generated by the institutional dynamics the governance's operation produced. The institutional character made the conspiracy more threatening than a personal conspiracy would have been. A personal conspiracy, a conspiracy motivated by personal grievance, would have been limited by the grievance's personal scope, would have operated within the dimensions the personal motivation encompassed. An institutional conspiracy, a conspiracy motivated by institutional interest, was limited only by the institution's scope, operated within the dimensions the institutional interest encompassed, deployed the institutional resources the institution's capability provided. The Tlilax deployed the institutional resources, the Gola technology, the face dancer capability, the biological engineering the tradition maintained. The Guild deployed the institutional resources, the navigational leverage, the prescient interference, the political influence the monopoly provided. Irulan deployed the domestic access, the positioning inside the governance's personal sphere the political marriage provided, the operational capability the domestic proximity enabled. The combined deployment was the conspiracy's institutional expression, the coordinated application of multiple institutions' resources toward the objective the institutional interests aligned on. The coordination was the conspiracy's most sophisticated quality, the management of multiple institutional actors' contributions toward the common objective the institutional interests produced. The Fremen warriors who had fought the jihad were returning to Arrakis during the Dune Messiah period, and the returning warriors' experience illuminated the civilization's transformation in its most personal dimension. The warriors had left Arrakis as the desert's people. They had gone to war as the Fremen, as the warriors whose capabilities the desert had forged, whose identity the water discipline had defined, whose values the Sietch culture had sustained. They had fought across the known universe in the Muad'Dib's name, had killed and conquered in the faith the messianic identification had generated. The warriors returned to Arrakis as the Empire's soldiers. The return placed the warriors who had fought the universe's war back in the environment the warriors' identity had been forged in, placed the desert's warriors back in the desert, placed the Fremen back among the Fremen, placed the persons whose identity the desert had created back in the conditions the identity was produced by. The return was disorienting. The warriors who had been the desert's people were no longer the desert's people in the way the desert's identity required. The warriors had seen other worlds, had experienced conditions the desert had not provided, had encountered environments the desert's conditions had not prepared them for. The warriors had wealth, had the plunder and the tribute the conquests had generated, had the material resources the desert's conditions had denied. The warriors were changed, were different from the persons who had left, were altered by the experiences the departure had provided. The change was the jihad's personal consequence, the transformation the war had produced in the warriors who fought it, The transformation was not the transformation the warriors' training had prepared them for. The training had prepared the warriors for the desert's demands. The training had not prepared the warriors for the return to the desert after the demands' experiences had been supplemented by the experiences the other world's conditions provided. The returning warriors' disorientation was a contributing factor to the governance's instability, was one of the dynamics the political landscape included alongside the conspiracy's institutional operation and the governance's personal deterioration. The warriors' changed condition produced the social dynamics the changed condition generated. The tensions between the returned warriors and the desert's continuing population, the adjustments the community's social structure required for the changed warriors' reintegration, the cultural negotiations the changed conditions encounter with the unchanged conditions produced. Paul observed the returning warriors' disorientation with the awareness the prescient vision provided. The consciousness could see the social dynamics the disorientation produced, could perceive the tensions, the adjustments, the cultural negotiations the returning warriors' changed condition generated. The observation was another dimension of the governance's comprehensive awareness, another set of dynamics the consciousness had to process, another category of consequences the consciousness had to manage. The 12 years' personal toll on Paul was the toll that the narrative's sustained attention documented, the progressive accumulation of the damage the prescient governance produced in the person who conducted it. The toll was visible. Not to the court. The court's observation could not detect the internal damage the prescient consciousness was sustaining. To the prescient consciousness itself, the consciousness that could perceive its own condition with the awareness the prescient capability brought to every dimension of the probability space's content. Paul could see his own destruction. The prescient vision that showed Paul the jihad's consequences and the conspiracy's operation and Chani's approaching death also showed Paul the damage the governance was producing in the consciousness that conducted it. The self-perception was the prescient capability's most devastating application, the consciousness observing its own progressive impairment with the clarity the prescient awareness provided. The self-perception was the consciousness's mirror, the reflection that showed the damage with the directness the prescient perception produced. The mirror showed the emotional erosion. The mirror showed the moral weight's accumulation. The mirror showed the psychological structure's progressive compromise. The mirror showed the consciousness's trajectory toward the unsustainability the 12 years' accumulation was producing. The mirror did not show the consciousness the repair. The prescient vision could perceive the damage without perceiving the remedy, could show the consciousness the destruction without showing the consciousness the reconstruction. The repair's absence was not the repair's impossibility. The repair's absence was the probability space's structure, the structure that included the damage's progression without including the damage's reversal, the structure whose paths all led through the damage's continuation rather than through the damage's correction. The absence was the prescient prison's deepest cruelty. The consciousness that could see its own destruction could not see its own healing. The consciousness that could perceive the damage's progression could not perceive the damage's repair. The vision showed the path. The path included the destruction. The path did not include the reconstruction. Paul walked the path, walked the 12 years, walked toward the destruction the path included, and the desert walk the destruction would eventually produce. The walking was not chosen, was not the free selection of the path the person preferred. The walking was the least terrible option's acceptance, the consciousness's sustained assessment that the path's destruction was less terrible than the alternatives the probability space contained. The assessment was correct. The prescient consciousness's assessment of the alternatives was informed by the comprehensive awareness the prescient capability provided, was the assessment of a consciousness that could see every alternative, every path, every option the probability space encompassed. The assessment concluded that the 12 years path, the path that included the jihad's moral weight, the conspiracies' erosion, the beloved's death, the blindness, the desert walk, was the least terrible path the space contained. The correctness was the tragedy. The path was the least terrible. The path was also the path that destroyed the person who walked it. The least terrible path was still the path of destruction. The destruction was the path's content. The content was the tragedy. The tragic fate of Paul Atreides was not the fate of a person who chose wrong. The tragic fate was the fate of a person who chose right, who chose the least terrible option, who chose the path the comprehensive assessment identified as least damaging, and who was destroyed by the choice's correctness. The correctness and the destruction coexisted. The path was correct. The path was destructive. The coexistence was the tragedy. Paul walked the correct path into the desert. The desert was the correct destination. The tragedy was that the correct destination was the desert. The Dune Tarot, the oracular card system the Dune Messiah narrative introduced, was the cultural expression of the prescient capability's democratized form, and the tarot's presence in the narrative illuminated the relationship between the prescient consciousness and the culture the consciousness inhabited. The tarot was the popular prescience, the reduced, accessible, culturally mediated version of the prescient awareness the Kwisatz Haderach possessed in its full form. The tarot's users did not perceive the probability space directly, did not experience the prescient consciousness's comprehensive awareness of the branching futures the space contained. The tarot's users consulted the cards, engaged with the symbolic representations the cards provided, interpreted the symbols through the cultural frameworks the tarot's tradition maintained, produced the assessments the symbolic interpretation generated. The tarot was the prescient capability reduced to the cultural practice, the comprehensive awareness compressed into the symbolic system, the probability space's perception mediated through the card's imagery. The reduction was real. The tarot's users received a fraction of the prescient consciousness's awareness, filtered through the symbolic system's categories and the interpretive tradition's frameworks. The reduction was also the access, the mechanism through which the prescient capability's cultural significance was made available to the populations whose consciousness did not possess the capability's direct form. The tarot's presence in the culture was the prescient consciousness's cultural consequence, the effect the Kwisatz Haderach's demonstrated prescience produced in the civilization the Kwisatz Haderach governed. The demonstration of the prescient capability, Paul's sustained exercise of the prescient awareness in the governance's political dimension, had established the prescient consciousness as a cultural reality, had made the prescient awareness a thing the culture accepted and the culture's practices reflected. The tarot was the culture's reflection of the prescient reality. The card's imagery drew on the Muad'Dib mythology, on the messianic narrative the faith had produced, on the symbolic framework the worship had generated. The imagery was the mythology's expression in the oracular form, the messianic narrative's content rendered as the symbols the oracular practice employed. Paul's experience of the tarot was the experience of the person whose consciousness was the tarot's source, the person whose prescient capability the tarot's symbolic system was the cultural reduction of. Paul could perceive the tarot's operation through the prescient awareness, could see the tarot's users' consultations, could perceive the interpretations the consultations produced, could assess the relationship between the symbolic system's outputs and the probability space's actual structure. The relationship was imprecise. The tarot symbolic system produced outputs whose correspondence to the probability space's actual structure was partial. Was the approximation the symbolic mediation generated, rather than the direct perception the prescient consciousness provided? The imprecision was the cultural practice's limitation, the consequence of the reduction from the comprehensive awareness to the symbolic system. The imprecision did not reduce the tarot's cultural significance. The practice was maintained. The consultations were conducted. The interpretations were produced and believed and acted on. The cultural significance was the significance of the practice's participation in the prescient framework the messianic governance had established, the significance of the population's engagement with the oracular tradition the prescient consciousness's demonstration had made culturally available, the comparison between Paul and Leto II, between the father's trajectory and the son's trajectory, was the comparison the Dune Messiah narrative established, and that the saga's subsequent novels would develop into the saga's most sustained argument about the messianic role's consequences. Paul's trajectory was the trajectory of refusal, the prescient consciousness that perceived the golden path, that saw in the probability space's structure the response the species' existential threat required, was the consciousness that refused the response's cost. Paul saw the golden path. Paul understood the golden path's requirements, the transformation, the 3,500-year governance, the sacrifice of everything the human experience encompassed. Paul understood and refused. The refusal was the desert walk, the departure from the position the prescient consciousness occupied, the evacuation from the governance the prescient awareness showed was necessary. Leto II's trajectory would be the trajectory of acceptance. The child whose pre-born consciousness perceived the same golden path the father had perceived, who saw the same response the species' existential threat required, would accept the response's cost. Leto would undergo the transformation. Leto would conduct the 3,500-year governance. Leto would sacrifice everything the human experience encompassed. The comparison was the saga's argument about the messianic role's demands. The father could not sustain the demands. The son accepted the demands. The acceptance and the refusal were both responses to the same awareness, to the same probability space's structure, the same existential threat, the same required response. The difference was in the person's relationship with the response, in the father's assessment that the response's cost exceeded what the person could bear, and the son's assessment that the response's cost did not exceed what the species' survival justified. Paul's refusal was the human response. The person who assessed the role's demands and concluded the demands exceeded the person's capacity was the person responding with the human consciousness's honest assessment of the human capacity's limits. The assessment was not wrong. The demands did exceed the capacity. The 12 years of governance had demonstrated the demand's exceedance. The desert walk was the honest acknowledgement of the exceedance. Leto's acceptance would be the superhuman response. The child who assessed the same demands and concluded the demands could be born was the consciousness whose pre-born development and whose prescient awareness had produced an assessment different from the father's. An assessment that concluded the demand's bearing was possible despite the demand's cost. That the cost's acceptance was justified by the species' survival's value, that the person's sacrifice was the price the species' survival required. The comparison was the saga's most sustained argument about the relationship between the human and the superhuman. the demonstration that the prescient consciousness's demands exceeded the human capacity, and that the demands bearing required the superhuman capacity the consciousness's development could produce. Paul was human. Paul's capacity was human. Paul's capacity was exceeded by the demands. Paul walked into the desert. Leto would be superhuman, would develop through the sandworm transformation the capacity that exceeded the demands the human capacity could not sustain. The transformation was the capacity's production, the conversion of the human consciousness into the consciousness whose capabilities included the demands sustained bearing. The conversion was the tragedy's extension. Paul's tragedy was the tragedy of the human consciousness exceeding its capacity. Leto's tragedy would be the tragedy of the consciousness converting itself into something that could sustain the exceeding, into something that was no longer human in the way the human consciousness the conversion replaced had been. The two tragedies were the saga's dual examination of the messianic role's cost. The first tragedy said, the human cannot bear the role. The second tragedy said, the role can be borne, but only by transforming the human into something that is no longer human. The dual examination was the saga's argument completed. The messianic role was destructive in both dimensions. The role destroyed the human who could not bear it. The role transformed the bearer who could bear it into something that was no longer human. The destruction and the transformation were both costs. The costs were both devastating. The costs were both the role's products. The desert walk's meaning for the Fremen's faith was the meaning that the departure produced in the religious framework the messianic identification had sustained, the meaning that the Messiah's departure imposed on the faith the Messiah's presence had generated. The departure was theologically ambiguous. The Fremen's religious framework, the messianic tradition the Missionaria Protectiva had installed and the Lisan al-Gaib's identification had activated, did not include the provision for the Messiah's departure. The framework included the Messiah's arrival. The framework included the Messiah's governance. The framework did not include the Messiah's walking away. The ambiguity produced the theological interpretations the departure's cultural processing required. The Kizarate, the religious institution whose management of the faith's doctrinal content the governance had sustained, would have to provide the interpretive framework the departure's accommodation demanded. The framework would have to explain the departure within the messianic narrative the faith was organized around, would have to account for the Messiah's walking away in terms the faith's coherence could sustain. The interpretation the Kizarati would develop, the incorporation of the departure into the messianic narrative as the next phase of the prophecy's fulfillment, rather than as the prophecy's abandonment, was the interpretation the institution's survival required. The faith could not survive the interpretation that the Messiah had abandoned the role. The faith could survive the interpretation that the Messiah had entered the next phase the role encompassed, that the desert walk was the prophecy's continuation rather than the prophecy's termination. The interpretation was the institution's adaptation, the Kizarate's institutional response to the departure's theological crisis, the doctrinal management the faith's continued operation demanded. The adaptation was the institution's most consequential theological act, the conversion of the departure's crisis into the departure's accommodation, the transformation of the abandonment's threat into the continuation's assurance. Paul would have perceived this interpretation. The prescient consciousness that departed, the consciousness that walked into the desert with the awareness the probability space's comprehensive perception provided, could have seen the interpretation the departure would produce, the doctrinal accommodation the institution would develop, the faith's continued operation despite the Messiah's absence. The perception was another dimension of the tragedy's ironic character. The Messiah whose departure was intended to end the messianic role's operation was the Messiah whose departure the institution would incorporate into the messianic narrative's continuation. The departure did not end the faith. The departure extended the faith, provided the faith with new content, new mystery, new doctrinal material the institution could manage and the faithful could believe. The Messiah could not escape the messianic role by departing. The departure was incorporated into the role. The walking away was absorbed into the mythology. The blind man in the desert became the next chapter of the story the faith was organized around. The inescapability was the prescient prison's final expression. The consciousness that could not prevent the jihad could not prevent the faith's continuation. The consciousness that could not change the probability space's structure could not change the cultural dynamics structure. The departure was the consciousness's escape attempt. The attempt was absorbed. The escape failed. Paul walked into the desert. The faith followed him. The mode of consciousness that the prescient awareness constituted deserves the sustained philosophical examination the mode's significance demanded. The examination of what the prescient awareness was as a mode of cognitive operation, and what the mode's character revealed about the relationship between knowledge and experience. The ordinary consciousness experienced time sequentially. The present was the experienced moment. The past was the memory. The future was the anticipation, the projection of the present's patterns into the temporal dimension the present had not yet reached. The sequential experience was the ordinary consciousness's temporal mode, the way the consciousness engaged with time through the succession of experienced moments the temporal progression provided. The prescient consciousness experienced time simultaneously. The present was the experienced moment. The past was the memory. The future was the perception, the direct awareness of the temporal dimension the ordinary consciousness could only anticipate. The simultaneous experience was the prescient consciousness temporal mode, the way the consciousness engaged with time through the concurrent awareness of the present and the probable future the prescient capability provided. The simultaneity was the mode's defining quality. The prescient consciousness did not anticipate the future. The prescient consciousness perceived the future. The perception was as direct as the present's perception, was experienced with the same immediacy the present moment's experience provided, was encountered with the same vividness the direct awareness produced. The future was not theory. The future was experience. The experiential character of the future's perception was the mode's most consequential feature. The feature that produced the burden the prescient consciousness carried, and that the ordinary consciousness's anticipatory mode did not generate. The ordinary consciousness anticipated the future and was wrong. The anticipation was the projection, the extension of the present's patterns into the future's dimension. The projection was imprecise, was the approximation the pattern extension produced rather than the direct perception the actual future's encounter would have provided. The imprecision was the ordinary consciousness's protection, the protection that the anticipation's wrongness provided against the future's actual content. The prescient consciousness perceived the future and was right. The perception was the direct awareness, the encounter with the future's actual structure through the prescient capability's comprehensive perception. The perception was precise, was the accurate apprehension of the future's content that the prescient mode's direct engagement produced. The precision was the prescient consciousness's burden, the burden that the perception's accuracy imposed through the future's content's emotional and moral weight. The protection and the burden were the two modes' respective consequences. The ordinary consciousness was protected by its wrongness, was shielded from the future's content by the anticipation's imprecision. The prescient consciousness was burdened by its rightness, was loaded with the future's content by the perception's accuracy. Paul was burdened by his rightness. Every perception the prescient awareness produced was the accurate apprehension of the future's content. Every apprehension added the content's weight to the consciousness's load. The load accumulated with the accuracy the perception sustained. The accumulation was the burden's mechanism. The mechanism was the tragedy's deepest architecture. The consciousness was destroyed by its own accuracy, was consumed by the precision of the perception the capability provided. The destruction was not the enemy's achievement. The destruction was the capability's product, was generated by the consciousness's own operation, was produced by the perception's own accuracy. The capability destroyed its possessor. The perception consumed its perceiver. The knowledge eliminated its knower. This was the prescient consciousness's condition, the condition that the Dune Messiah narrative documented through Paul's experience and that the Desert Walk's departure was the response to. The condition was the saga's deepest argument about the relationship between knowledge and the person who possesses it. The argument said, knowledge is not free. Knowledge costs the knower. The cost is proportional to the knowledge's comprehensiveness. The more the consciousness knows, the more the knowing costs the consciousness that knows. The prescient consciousness knew everything. The knowing's cost was the consciousness's destruction. Paul paid the cost. The desert walk was the payment's final installment. The blind man walked into the sand. The sand accepted the blind man. The sand had always accepted the blind, had always been the destination the Fremen tradition said the blind walked toward. Paul walked toward the sand. The sand waited. The sand was patient. The most powerful consciousness in human history walked into the desert because the consciousness could not sustain the power the consciousness possessed. The desert accepted the walk. The faith absorbed the departure. The twins remained. The saga continued. The tragic fate of Paul Atreides in Dune Messiah.